joining us a bit later, so, you know, as they come in. So you don't have to fool them because they're not late. We're just starting early. All right, I'm delighted to be here. Many of you are familiar faces. I think as I started preparing for this, I realized that we first had an event here in 2012. So this has been going on for quite a while. We missed a couple of years, of course, with COVID, and last year we did a virtual meeting. But I'm really delighted to have everybody and see all you guys again. So let me see if I can get this going. Okay, perfect. What I wanted to say is that, as you might have known, I had tried to be sort of a one-man band for a number of years trying to get this going, and it just was too much. And so Maureen, this year, said, okay, we're going to have a group and we're going to help. And I have to say, this couldn't have happened without Maureen. She has been sort of the ringmaster of a three-ring circus to get everybody together, all the partners that were on the prior one. And sometimes maybe a lion tamer, and sometimes maybe even a little bit of a magician. But so, anyway, this really came together as a team, and I'm proud to be up here kind of representing her and everybody else that came in. Also, Kathy brought a lot of the volunteers. She's also on Kent Lakes Association, and they have really stepped up with volunteers. They'll be helping with setup and cleanup and taking recycling to the Putnam recycling areas. So I just want to say thank you again to her. Nina, unless it's Nina. This, as I said, we have used this facility since 2012, off and on. And I give the greatest thanks to Sedgwood, both the club and the Sedgwood Lake Association for getting us in here and being able to have this wonderful event. I hope you all realize what a beautiful site this is. It can be used for other events if you want to rent it, and that's part of, I think, how we get to have it. So please, please realize this is really a wonderful thing that they do for us, and treat this with respect. We're going to have to, you know, we try not to scrape the floors with the chairs, etc. So be really good about it. Jennifer Lerner. So she was really the lead from the Putnam CCE, Cornell Cooperative Extension, but there was a whole team there. We would not, we passed over, okay, you do the registration, you do the food, and they just helped so much. So that really took an awful lot off of us, and I'm really, really grateful for all they've done. Pat was one of the first people I met, and I think she's here volunteering again today. And of course, my partner in crime from Nicefola is Ina. She's also on the board, and she helped organize some of this. So, Pat, ground rules. All right, so it's wonderful to have you all here. But if you don't feel well, please go away. There's no really nice way to say it, but if you start feeling not good, everybody here would appreciate it if you leave, okay? But we love having you as long as you feel well. Okay, the restrooms, there's one sort of ADA upstairs. There are more downstairs. We have short breaks. We want to keep people on time, so you know, if you can, or if there's a line up here, head downstairs. If we want people, we have a really tight, we do have a tight schedule. So please return from breaks, from lunch. Lunch this year will be in boxes. You all selected what you wanted. Please remember, and you were reminded. They will be labeled, so please take what you said you were going to take, because not everybody loves eggplant. there are recycling containers available. If you get a phone call, if you can't help discussing something with somebody else, please take it outside. That makes a great, it just respects what's going on in the room. But at the same time, I want to say, this is an opportunity for lakes from across this area to get together and talk about your issues and what's going on. So embrace that. And as you might know, presentations are going to be videotaped. I'll tell you, they're going to go up on the Putnam CCE website. And many people have asked me about it, and so because we actually had to close this early, not everybody who wanted to come could get in, so I'm really grateful for that. I just want to mention one more thing that we have done. As kind of just a trial, so if you happen to be wandering and don't have someone to talk to, I'd sort of like to collect what things you like best about your lakes and things that could be improved. So there's an easel at the back with a poster, and you can put up, with stickers. Say what you like, say what you don't. We'd like to sort of I would like to get a better sense of this, and we can compile it and send it out to people. Okay. I did want to talk a little bit about Nicefola, in part because we got so many questions here. We do have an annual statewide conference. It's a couple of days. It's more than what we really had. The one this year already happened. It was at the end of April. Next year it'll be the first weekend in May. It will be at Lake George. Now, some people this year attended virtual sessions. We only had like 17 or 18 people attend virtual sessions, and it costs like $2,000 to $2,500, something like that, to do the virtual. So there's sort of a feeling that they won't do virtual again unless people really want it. So if you want it, you have to let Nancy, Nicefola Nancy, know, because otherwise we'll just go back to probably all in person. There is a website. Oh, sorry, we do regional meetings like this one. There's also one, I don't think anybody here traveled from Central or Western, but some people might have come down from Mid-Hudson. There is another regional meeting. That's all on our website. We do have a Nicefola Facebook page. And it just occurred to me, Nicefola is New York State Federation of Lake Associations, for those of you who don't know what it is. There's an Ask Dr. Lake feature. So if you have a question, sort of generally about lakes, and you want to know a little bit more, ask Dr. Lake. And we do have CSLAP jointly with DEC. So a lot of people tried to, or wanted to sign up for CSLAP this year. So I want to give a little bit of clarity about it. CSLAP is the Citizens Statewide Lake Assessment Program, and it's been run since 1986, jointly by DEC and Nicefola. And annually, we do water quality sampling for about 180 lakes or sites. Some lakes have more than one site. The volunteers, so this is this year, sample about 8 times a season. We have a new contract coming up, which may have some changes, but I can't talk about that yet because it's not been signed. But there's physical observations. What's the clarity of the lake? How bad are the plants? How good are the plants? If you're a fisherman, how is it for recreation? And then you collect water samples that get sent off to a lab, and there's you can do harmful algal bloom. You can get reports, or you can report how your lake is doing as far as that. But I have to tell you, because we got a lot of people when we said we were doing CSLAP training today, a lot of people said, I live on a lake, I want to join. We generally set it for the next year by October. So if you're interested, now is the time to get in touch with Nancy, who's our director really at Nicefola. And again, it's Nicefola@verizon.net. Okay? parts are, because we'll introduce each speaker, we have a break at 10:30, and we have lunch at just before noon, and at 2 o'clock will be when we ask people to split. If you're a CSLAP volunteer for training, you will be invited to go downstairs. The rest of the people will sort of clear out so that we can clean up the room. So, our first person is Rachel. Oh, there. I'm sorry, I didn't see you at first.
Actually, could I steal the mic just for a second?
Sure.
So, hi, I'm Maureen, and as Jan says, I'm sort of like, I don't know, she makes me out to sound like I'm the ringleader of the bunch, but I have to say, you know, I did work as the liaison on this, and I think I was a great point person for that, because I belong to like all those partners, right? I'm from Seven Hills Lake in Kent, and we are a member of NYSTOLA. We do participate in CSLAP. I'm the chair of the Seven Hills Lake Committee. I am also represent Seven Hills Lake on the Kent Lakes Association, and I'm a master gardener volunteer at Cornell, so I have like my hands in everything. And I have to say, it's been such a pleasure for Cornell to partner with NYSTOLA and KLA. We've done this in the past with you guys. So I want to just say, like, what a super fabulous experiences, and I really think you're going to love all these presentations. We have, you know, a wealth of experts here, and even the experts are telling me they want to hear the other experts. So the other thing I just wanted to mention is we have some great exhibitors around the room, so please make sure you stop at every table. Up here to my left is Fish and Wildlife, so if you have a geese issue, this is the place you want to come for information. We have the Watershed Agricultural Council that has wonderful resources for your lake, free. So stop there. Next to that is Lower Hudson Prism. So we have a great AIS display. In the back is our Cornell table, and we have tons of programs all year long. And don't forget, we have Pond and Lake to thank as one of our corporate sponsors, and they have a fabulous display table in the back. So, you know, make on your break and take advantage of all those great resources at your disposal. So, okay, here you go. Back to Jan. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, so it has been a pleasure working with Maureen, and I echo, I apologize to USDA for having my back to them. No offense. All right, so our first presentation is the lake effect on wastewater management by Rachel Schnabel. Now, I met Rachel when she was doing a study of Lake Wakaba, and I was not only impressed by the study, which I think she's going to talk about, but also, you know, her communication out to the community and her ability to communicate to the town board when she eventually, at the end of the project, we talked to the town board about what had been done, and I thought she gave it just great presentation. So I asked her to come here today, and I'm really pleased. But let me give the official introduction. She's a professional engineer with a bachelor's degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Environmental Engineering with a minor in geology. She has 10 years of experience in consulting and currently works at Barton and Lajeunesse, which we always call B&L for the entire time. And she works on a variety of wastewater, drinking water, and stormwater projects. I'm really pleased to turn this over to Rachel, and I hope Maureen has set up the presentation. If not, let me try to do it. Okay, come on up. You have to ad lib. Well,
thank you for that introduction, Jan. Don't worry, I can ad lib. I used to do improv comedy. You know, people never think about doing improv comedy, and they really should, because there's some really funny people out there, and it's really fun. And the number one rule is you say whatever comes to mind, and that just naturally happens to be funny. Look, a bee. Anyway, as Jan mentioned, my company's name is not particularly easy to pronounce. It's Barton and Judas, and yes, we commonly go by B&L for that reason. So, if you're interested in talking to me or my coworker Eric Duden during the break, we're both here to answer questions about how we can help your community or any questions you might have about the presentation. Does this work on the?
all right, yes, so that's where you should have a pointer at the top and the forward back.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to get a little bit of background on the project that Jan mentioned, which is Lake Study on Lake Wacabuc. Then I'm going to talk about septic systems, just some basics about how they work and why they fail. And then we're going to discuss the phosphorus model that we did for the lake study and some wastewater management solutions that we evaluated. So the town of Lewisboro obtained a grant to do lake studies on 3 of their lakes, Lake Wacabuc, Lake Truesdale, and Lake Kitchewan. This was through the New York City DEP because these 3 lakes ultimately discharge to the Cross River Reservoir, so that's part of the New York City water supply. There were 2 goals of this study. The first being to identify how much of the phosphorus going to these lakes is coming from septic systems, because they all have no phosphorus problems. And then the second was to determine what's a good wastewater management solution if failing and poorly functioning septic systems is the main issue. So as I said, we already knew that phosphorus was the primary pollutant of concern in Lake Wacabuc. And this is because of the CSLAP program that Jen was just speaking about. So the CSLAP data showed a significant increase in phosphorus since 1986. And to give you an idea, the New York State limit for phosphorus is 0.02 milligrams per liter. Well, in 2020, during the shutdown, when everybody was escaping to their lake houses, the data showed a peak phosphorus concentration of 0.053 milligrams per liter. So that's over twice what the limit is on phosphorus. So why are we concerned about phosphorus? It's a nutrient. Isn't that a good thing? Well, while nutrients are essential to lake health, they can also be considered a source of pollution. It's sort of that too much of a good thing kind of theme. So what happens when there's too much phosphorus is you can get more invasive species, lake weed growing. Plants, they love phosphorus. That's what makes them grow. And the same thing for algal blooms. And some of those algal blooms are harmful, also known as harmful algal blooms or HABs. So those are harmful to human health. You don't want to be swimming in that. The image to the left, that is a picture of Lake Wacabuc when there's an algal bloom going on. When you have all these plants growing, they're taking up oxygen. So then you get an oxygen depletion in the lake, and that can kill the fish. It also impairs drinking water. And that's not even just for the New York City water supply, that's also for some of the lake residents. Some of them actually take the water straight from the lake. And then obviously that puts limits on recreational opportunities. So this is why we're really concerned about lakes that have too much phosphorus. So this is the study area. I know it might be a little difficult to see. It's outlined in red. And it's basically the watershed. Well, with the exception of the 2 lakes here, Brooklyn and Oskaleta actually drain into Lake Wacabuc, but the way the grant program was set up, they excluded them from the study. But anyway, in case you don't know what a watershed is, the whole concept is if a raindrop were to fall anywhere within this area, it would eventually end up in the lake. So whether it's going directly into the lake, into a stream that leads to the lake, whether it's stormwater runoff that ends up in the lake, or or if it infiltrates into the ground and groundwater will eventually reach the lake. And just to give you an idea, there's about 370 parcels in this study area. Okay, septic systems. So for those of you who aren't on sewer, you probably have some kind of septic system. Well, unless you have an outhouse. So just a little background. If you have a conventional septic system, this is a pretty standard septic system. You've got your wastewater coming from the house, and that could be from toilets, sinks, your dishwasher, your laundry washer, and then they go into the septic tank, which is a very key component, and I'll get more into that in a second. And then it will drain into what we call the drain field or the leach field. There's usually a distribution box where it separates the wastewater into different trenches, and that might have piping with holes in it and gravel surrounding it. And then ultimately, it should infiltrate into the ground. So the reason that a septic tank is so important is because it's a level of treatment. It actually separates out the scum and the sludge. So when the wastewater comes in, it comes through these baffles, and it does that because then you've got your water coming in here and it's not disrupting these top and bottom layers. And as the wastewater moves through here, it starts to separate. And then there's even sometimes an effluent filter on the baffle going out. And the whole point of this is to keep all that scum and all that sludge from getting to your drain field. If it gets to the drain field, it can plug up the soils, and that can cause your septic system to fail. So that is why septic tanks should be pumped out regularly. EPA recommends every 3 to 5 years. Your town code or your county health code might have more stringent guidelines. It might be more like every 2 years. But it's amazing how many people I talk to who own septic systems and they have no idea that they're supposed to regularly pump out their tanks. So if there's one thing you take away from my presentation, please, please, please regularly pump out your septic tank. Okay, so for some of you who don't have a conventional septic system, you might have something more like a seepage pit or a cesspool. And so those are essentially the same thing. It's this round tank here with holes in it. Because it's a tank, it goes deeper into the ground, and it has a smaller footprint, so it's a more concentrated place where wastewater is going into the ground. The difference between a seepage pit and a cesspool is that cesspools don't have a septic tank before it, and so you don't have that level of treatment. And for that reason, cesspools are no longer covered under the state health code. So what that means is if you already have a cesspool that's typically grandfathered in, but you're not allowed to just build a cesspool with, you can't put in this pit without having a septic tank. Seepage pits, they're not the best form of a septic system. I will talk a little bit about that in a second. So generally, the state code only allows it if you can't put in a conventional septic system. And over the years, the health code, it becomes more and more stringent with how these septic systems are installed, and that can really come into play when we're talking about older septic systems. They might not have as good as separation distances to groundwater and that sort of thing, which can be an issue.
Excuse me?
Yes.
What's the recommendation for the community in a regular cleansing of the tank or pumping of the tank? What do we recommend?
In terms of having your septic tank pumped out, or? Yeah, so you would hire a contractor to come out and they would pump out your tank.
Yes, I'm talking about the regularity. What does that mean?
Frequency. So EPA recommends that you have it pumped out every 3 to 5 years. There are some codes out there that might be more stringent, like every 2 years. And it also kind of depends on, how many people do you have in the household? How many were there when the septic system was installed? Was it built for, 2 bedrooms and now you have 4? Well, then you might want to have it pumped out more regularly. Is it a big septic system with a 4-bedroom house? Maybe there's only 2 of them. So then maybe you want to wait more to the 5, every 5 years. But the cost it takes to pump out your septic tank compared to replacing a failed septic system, it is worth the investment.
Okay, so seepage pits. EPA put out an article in 2001 about how they can endanger groundwater quality. And this is why. So there's this nice cross section here, and you've got the house and the wastewater going in the septic tank, and then they're simultaneously showing the difference between if it goes out to this leach field with the trenches, or if it goes out to a seepage pit. Now, the thing with the trenches is you have so much more separation distance to groundwater. Whereas a seepage pit is a lot closer to the groundwater table. So the important thing about the soils is sort of twofold. One, particularly closer to the surface, the soils have lots of oxygen, and that's important for the bacteria that are in the soils, because it's ultimately the bacteria that's treating the wastewater. And so we want happy bacteria. But then there's also some other things going on with the wastewater, some chemistry going on. In fact, a lot of phosphorus gets treated by an ion exchange that causes the phosphorus to become a solid, to come out of that wastewater and then just get filtered out by the soil. So when you have wastewater that's discharging that much closer to the groundwater table, you're cutting out that ability for the soil to really do what it's supposed to do. Another concern is that when wastewater is going into the groundwater, the more concentrated that point is where the wastewater is going in, the more likely it is for the groundwater to actually build up in that area. And that's what this shape is here. They're showing what we call a groundwater mound. So groundwater moves very slowly. So if you're putting a lot of wastewater in a small footprint, it's going to build up. And then when it builds up, there's even less space in the soil for the bugs and the chemistry to do its magic and clean that wastewater. So for the study, as I mentioned before, we had to identify septic systems that we thought were poorly functioning and failing. So I wanted to talk about what does poorly functioning mean. Well, to the left you can see a septic system that's working properly. You know, the wastewater's going in the ground and it's getting clean and then it goes in the groundwater. If it's poorly functioning, something's happening where the wastewater is reaching the groundwater table before it's properly treated. And that can be caused by environmental constraints or just the age of the septic system. And then a failing septic system, you know, this is more what we think about, is when the wastewater, for whatever reason, it can't get into the ground and it either is rising up or it backs into the house. So that's what we're talking about when we say a failing septic system. Okay, so I've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but when you have this wastewater that's untreated and it's reaching the lake, there's three different ways it can do that. It can go directly over the land, so let's say you have a failing septic system on a lakefront property, or a property that's right on a stream that leads to the lake. So that wastewater is going from the land directly into the water. You could also have stormwater and soil erosion carrying wastewater from a failing septic system in the watershed to a stream or the lake itself. And then if you have a poorly functioning septic system, then that wastewater is getting untreated, it's reaching the groundwater table, and the groundwater can carry it to the lake. So there's all these different ways that if a septic system isn't working the way it should, that the wastewater is reaching the lake. So we ran a phosphorus model for the lake study, for Lake Wacabuck. We used a software called Model My Watershed. And so the idea was trying to figure out, okay, where is phosphorus coming from? How much of it is coming from septic systems? And in order to run this model, we had to figure out how many of the septic systems in the study area are failing and how many might be poorly functioning. So for failing septic systems, we looked at the county health department information for, septic systems that had to be repaired or replaced. We also did a public survey, and with that information, we found that approximately 2 septic systems are failing every year. Now, there could be more failures that we don't know about. Yes?
How did you determine if there wasn't a backup in the house and the person didn't know their septic isn't functioning optimally? How were you guys able to determine what one safe and didn't know the septic wasn't?
That's the thing about the data with the study. So the question was, how did we know that the failing septic system wasn't because there up into the house versus it rising to the ground surface? And the answer is we ultimately didn't know. We had to make certain assumptions, and you'll see later that based on our assumptions, we kind of gave a wide range of, okay, what does this mean in terms of how much phosphorus is coming from septic systems? But another thing to note is that there could be failing septic systems that people don't want anyone to know about because they can't afford to repair it. It's really expensive, and so that might not have been accounted for. Yes?
Could you tell us on your test data samples?
So we did take some samples in the lake to see where the highest concentrations of phosphorus were, but we did not, the study was not so thorough that we actually went and inspected every single septic system. That would be a future phase.
Is there something that you could do to test your own? Like if I wanted to test and make sure mine is running properly, is there something I can do to figure that out if I have no problems that I know of?
So the question is how can you have your septic system inspected to make sure it's running properly? So as I mentioned before, pumping out your septic tank is really important, and part of that pump out is actually an inspection of the tank. So they look into the tank, they see if maybe there's some leaks coming in from groundwater, or cracks where wastewater could be leaving the tank. They make sure that the wastewater is flowing out to the leach fields. They see whether or not the sludge and the scum are going to the leach field when it shouldn't. You can have them feed a camera through, so that's an additional step. And they can run it through the pipes and do things that way. They could also flood the system with water and see if it backs up. I know that's what I did for my septic system before I bought my home. So there are different things you can do. Unfortunately, some of the environmental constraints, which we're going to get to in a second, you aren't necessarily going to know unless you do, install monitoring wells on your property and see how shallow groundwater is. Yes?
What about dye testing?
Dye testing is good. I've definitely done dye testing before to try to identify a source of wastewater to a body of water. The difficulty with the dye testing is unless it's going straight to the lake, the dye can really get diluted. There are different types of dye out there, though, that you can actually sample for that concentration, so even if you can't see it, you can test for it and see whether or not there's any present. Unfortunately, that dye is also sometimes used in detergents, so you could get a false negative, or a false positive. Okay, so earlier I was talking about poorly functioning septic systems. There's, again, two things that can cause this. There's environmental constraints and age. So with environmental constraints, and this goes, if you look in your health code when it comes to designing a septic system, there's parameters for all of these, and for good reason. So there's steepness of slopes. You don't want to have a septic system where there's a slope of 15% or more. And that's because when you have a slope, and the wastewater hits the groundwater, and the groundwater table raises up a little bit, it can come right out of the ground. That's much more likely on a slope. There's depth to bedrock. So if the wastewater reaches bedrock before it's treated, bedrock tends to have bedrock fractures. And we have no way of knowing, how those are connected, where they may lead. They could lead straight to the lake. There's depth to seasonal high groundwater. So the reason I say seasonal high is the groundwater table actually fluctuates, and the seasonal high typically occurs in the spring when you've got all the snow melt and all the April showers and that sort of thing. So when you're designing a septic system, it's really important to know, what is the highest point that the groundwater table gets. So if you're looking at these images, depth to bedrock is really shallow in these orangey areas. Depth to groundwater is shallow in the red areas, which is mainly where wetlands are. But it's also generally pretty shallow in these orange areas as well. There's also the infiltration rate of soils. The image right above it is actually soil suitability, so that takes into account the things we were just looking at on the previous slide. And this is based off of data from the USDA NRCS Wet Soil Survey, which is where we got a lot of this data. And so that kind of combines everything. So the soils in the study area were actually pretty good. Basically, there's two things you gotta worry about. Do the soils allow wastewater to go through too quickly so that it can't be treated properly? Or are the soils really tight together and they don't let the wastewater go down fast enough so that it backs up? There's also parcel size. So here we focused in on parcels that were less than half an acre. And that's because it has to do with the concentration. You know, you're putting so much wastewater in such a small area, it doesn't really give the soils an opportunity to treat the way they should. And another really big concern is you have these houses with these septic systems and these wells, and they're all right on top of each other. So you gotta be worrying about, you know, is your well water clean enough? And then there's the 100-foot buffer. So obviously properties that are right on the water or right on a stream, you know, if a failure were to happen or a poorly functioning septic system, that proximity can really make a difference. Okay, aging of septic systems. So most people don't know that septic systems, they kind of have a lifespan like you and me. As far as the components of the septic system itself, the life expectancy is about 50 years. US EPA says that the average lifespan is 15 to 40 years. It can be much more if properly maintained. Cornell Cooperative Extension said that they're really designed for a life of 20 to 30 years. And I like to think that with the new technology we have now, septic systems that are installed today with today's, you know, health code standards and everything are going to last longer, especially if they're maintained properly. But as far as the lifespan goes, you know, one of the really limiting factors is actually the soil's ability to hold that phosphorus that we were talking about earlier. You know, you've got that chemistry going on in the soils, but the soils only have so much ability to share ions to make that phosphorus solid and filter it out. So as you can imagine, you know, there's a lot of old septic systems in the study area. And again, we had to make assumptions about this data. We didn't know the exact age of the septic systems, but we knew the age of the buildings. We assumed septic systems were installed when the homes were installed, but in actuality, some of them might have been installed with an outhouse and then later upgraded. But as you can see, there's a lot of old homes in this area. We decided to be conservative and say, okay, 50 years or older, we know that's when the components start to go. We definitely want to focus on those. And you know what, if they're 30 to 49 years old and we don't have a record with the county health department of being regularly pumped out, we're concerned about those as well. But the data, you know, we use the best data that we could find. It is possible that somebody, you know, these people are pumping out their septic tanks, but the person who's doing it isn't reporting it to the county health department. They could be out of state. I mean, Lewisboro is right on the Connecticut border. They might be in another county, and so they just didn't report it to Westchester County. So when you put all that together, it really paints a picture of how there's just all of these different factors that can really work against these septic systems working properly. So red is, you know, the highest priority. We really want to come up with a wastewater management solution for these homes. And the deep orange is also of concern. When you start to move away from the lake, you start getting more properties that, you know, we aren't concerned about. We're going to talk in a second about community septic systems, but, you know, if your property can't really support a septic system, and you're on good terms with your neighbor, you could talk to your neighbor about them expanding their septic system and coming up with an agreement to share their septic system. Okay, so comparing results for how much phosphorus is coming from the septic system. So we're talking about this sort of salmony color. If we just put in 2 failing septic systems per year, the ones that we have on record, then it accounts for about 10% of the phosphorus going into the lake. If we put in the 2 failing septic systems plus 211 septic systems that we're concerned about, that's 92% of the phosphorus going into the lake. So again, we don't know exactly what's happening. We can't know until we actually inspect the septic systems, but we suspect that the amount of phosphorus going into the lake is significant, anywhere from 10% to 90%. So what are the wastewater? Yes.
A lot of these houses are in that 100-foot area.
So the 100-foot barrier, I had a question about the 100-foot buffer. Let's just go back to that image for a quick second. So the 100-foot buffer is that red, which of course homes that are on the lake tend to be as close to the lake as you can get, right? You want to be on that water. So if you have this long parcel here, you're not going to put your house up here, you're going to have it down here. So the closer your house is to the water, the more likely is that your septic system is close to the water, because they're usually gravity fed. So unless you have a pump pumping it up the hill, not to mention you want your septic system to be downgrading of your well. So even though the full parcel itself might not be fully within the 100-foot buffer, it's very possible the septic system is. And these tiny parcels up here, honestly, these ones are completely within the 100-foot buffer. Okay, so there's generally 4 different things you can do to manage your wastewater. You can replace your septic system. If the main issue is just that it's getting old, it might be time. Or maybe it wasn't properly maintained and now it's not working right. If you do have these environmental constraints where the groundwater table's really shallow or any of those other things that I was talking about, that might still not be enough. For this study, when we talked about replacing individual septic systems, which is honestly the cheapest option, we talked about, okay, well, for the sites that have environmental constraints, they may need to also have phosphorus treatment. We'll put in a tank, it's got some media, it needs to be changed out. I think it was once every 7 years. Easy to maintain. However, that's just focusing on the phosphorus because that's what the study cared about. What about the rest of the wastewater? As I mentioned before, you could do a community septic system. Because of the level of our study, we're a very high level study, we were looking at whether or not we could pull all the wastewater together and find somewhere, some land nearby where we could put all of it into the ground or several large systems. And that was really hard to find in this area. With the topography and everything, just wasn't a good solution. However, there is one lake community that already has some land set aside for their homes. There's about 30 homes, and that's a good option for them. We looked at connecting to the nearest water resource recovery facility. The nearest one is about 5 miles away, and the nearest edge of the sewer is about 4 miles away. That's pretty good. Unfortunately, this facility is already at capacity, and they just went through upgrades too. Not only that, they're on a parcel where they're completely out of space for more upgrades. The next nearest water resource recovery facilities are about 8 miles away. And when you talk about sending wastewater that far, it gets expensive very fast. And then the 4th option is put in your own water resource recovery facility, which is ultimately what we did recommend. Before you start having all these terrible images of, what would that look like in my community? Here's some images on the left. It's from the Oak Ridge condominiums on the other side of town. It's about the same size facility that this community would need. So that on the top, that's an image of the one of the condo buildings. In the middle, that is the water resource recovery facility. I know it might be hard to tell from the back, but they did the same kind of siding and everything as the other buildings. They made it blended to the community. And if you look at this bottom image, that's the facility right there. Here's a nice path with some tennis courts. I believe there's a basketball court nearby. So one of these people is holding a basketball. And they don't seem bothered at all by this facility here because it's completely enclosed. The building air is treated, there's noise mitigation measures. It's not this big, smelly thing that's going to make everybody sick. It's something that's going to clean the water and protect the environment. So to kind of emphasize what I mean when I say the lake effect, is that it's common for parcels in lake communities to be small and close together, to have septic systems that are right near the lake or stream leading to the lake, that have shallow groundwater, or that have outdated and aging septic systems. And all these factors can cause your septic system to fail or be poorly functioning. And then ultimately that leads to pollution of the lake. If you want more tips on how to maintain your septic system, EPA has a whole bunch of resources. Their next Septic Smart Week is in September, so keep your eyes open for that. I'm sure they'll have even more resources then. Do I have any more questions? Yes, I do. Yes.
You mentioned the water table several times, and it sort of seems obvious, but what's the scientific definition of where the watershed is? If I dig a hole, I go down.
Yes.
When does that happen?
So the water table, I remember it took me a while before I really grasped the concept of the water table, because you have soil. I remember when I was younger, I thought that there was just this cavernous space beneath the soil where there's a bunch of water. It's not like that at all. So basically you have your soil, and then at some point you reach groundwater where the water starts, and it's just in between the pore spaces of the soil, which is why it moves so slowly. So it's just wet soil basically, but it's all ultimately moving in a direction which is typically to your nearest water body. So if you dig a hole, yeah, you're trying to find where that groundwater is. There are things called a perched water table. So sometimes you might have soils that are really tight, especially if they have clay in them, that make it really difficult for the groundwater to move through. So you might have, or not groundwater, for the stormwater that's infiltrating, or the wastewater, to move through that layer. So when that happens, you can get what's called a perched water table. So after it rains, the rainwater goes in and it kind of sits on that layer before it can find its way down. And so sometimes you dig and you hit some water, but then you realize you've hit a bunch of clay or something to that effect, and you can dig under there and then you find the true groundwater table. Oh, goodness. Yes.
So aside from the solutions that you mentioned, is there anything that you could add to the lake to lower your phosphorus levels for biological control?
Are we going to have presentations that talk about that at all, Jan?
We have an internal one made.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about that a little bit.
All right, future presentation will cover that. Oh, okay, gotta end it. So if anybody has, yes,
Take one more question.
okay, I'll take one more question. Oh, goodness. You have your hand the highest.
If I understood correctly, you were talking about a septic tank that has phosphorus treatment built into it, is that correct? And if it is correct, could you speak more about that?
Sure. So it's separate from the septic tank. He's asking about the phosphorus treatment unit. So it's just another tank. It's basically your septic tank would discharge to this septic tank that would have the media in it, and then that would discharge to your drain field. So ideally, hopefully there's some space between your septic tank and your drain field to add that tank in. And it's completely passive. The technology that I know about, I think it's called RID. It's the person who invented it is out of Massachusetts, so right next door to here. I'm sure there are more technologies that are coming out. One thing to keep in mind with all these technologies, whether or not they've been tested by a third party. There's this wonderful test center on the Cape in Massachusetts, done by Barnstable County, and they test all kinds of treatment systems and drain fields to see how well they work with that kind of thing. But anyway, if you have any more questions, I'll be here during the break. I have business cards I can hand you too if you want to email me a question or anything like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. So again, I know some people have time for discussion at a break. So, I get to introduce our next speaker too. And I think many of you know Kevin Fitzpatrick. And if you do, you're lucky, because that means he's come and tried to find a way to treat some of the bad stormwater, or polluted stormwater that could be giving phosphorus to your watershed and to your lake. So, and I'm very pleased to have had a chance to talk to Kevin about some projects in our community, and would say that maybe he will talk some about some of the problems that not only does phosphorus give a problem, but there's that other key word, which is people, that sometimes are difficult to deal with. So, okay, so again, the official part here is Kevin is a graduate of Lafayette College and Manhattan College. He majored in civil engineering and joined the East of Hudson Watershed Corporation as a project manager in 2013. He's served as the director of the East of Hudson Watershed Corporation for the last 8 years, where he's managed over 100 stormwater retrofit projects, and I think we had at least one. And they're all aimed at increasing water quality within the New York City DEP drinking water supply. He's also introduced new technology and techniques to the New York State DEC for inclusion within this retrofit program. Through the program, he has a unique understanding of the logistics and financial financial challenges facing our local MS4s, and if you don't know what that is, he will probably tell you, and lake associations, and a great appreciation of what it takes to truly advance water quality within our watersheds. So I'm really pleased to have Kevin join us. So thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, everyone. So, thank you for that introduction. Again, I was going to do a quick intro to stormwater management, stormwater basics, how it's affecting development in our area, what the East of Hudson Watershed Corporation is, what our goals have been through the last decade, how that can affect your lakes, and I have a feeling your favorite part might be future funding and how we can help you guys out with problems that you're facing today and in the future. So the short of it is, and I say short, but the East of Hudson Watershed Corporation was founded to address phosphorus reduction requirements throughout the watershed for New York City's drinking water supply. This represents 19 different municipalities within Westchester, Putnam, and Dutchess, different counties, villages, and communities that came together with a common goal of having to reduce phosphorus and nitrogen within the drinking water supply for New York City. When we pooled all our resources together, we were able to have an approach that allowed if one stormwater project was installed in one region, it would benefit everyone. Because the idea is not every stormwater solution fits every community. Not every place has the ability to have a pond system put in. What we tried to do was identify the best projects at the best location where we can use the funding most appropriately. The corporation has been ongoing for the last 10-year period, and we are getting ready to look towards the next cycle, which I expect to be another 10 years coming up for us. So I'm gonna touch on some stormwater basics, and the science behind this just lightly, because I got a feeling it's going to be a lot of repeat for a lot of you folks from previous presentations you've had, and even future ones coming up. But the idea is with all stormwater systems, if we go back decades ago, this is what our lakes looked like. It was forested, undeveloped. All these systems had the ability to have natural filtration. As rainfall fell, it would hit the mounds reach our streams, reach our lakes, be taken up by the root systems of the trees. But as the decades have passed, we've installed subdivisions, we've installed roadways, septic systems. All these items have had a large effect on the stormwater cycle and hydrologic cycle, which this is a basic diagram that's used in just about every elementary school you come across in our nation, I think. But the idea is just simple. After a rainstorm, our rain would fall, hit our vegetation, our grounds, our mountains, our hills. If that hydrologic cycle is uninterrupted, that water would have a chance to infiltrate into the ground, recharge the water table before it would reach rivers and streams, gradually into our lake system, be taken up by plants and trees on the shores, evaporate back up into the air, reform clouds, the cycle is complete. Now, as we developed and began to put more houses and more roadways in, we kind of short-circuited that system and ended up, instead of rain being able to fall directly into the earth and recharge our systems, now it's falling onto our septic systems. It's falling into roadways, buildings, not getting a chance to infiltrate directly into the ground and instead carrying pollutants that we introduced during our development process. And now this is what we're left over with, is possible contamination within our lakes, nutrient loading into the systems. And that's not to say that development is bad, but it is to say that it's possible that within the last few decades, a lot of the development that has occurred just wasn't done with attention towards what the after effects would be. It wasn't done with thought in mind that we need to treat this water before it gets into our lakes. I'm just going to hit on this lightly because I know AJ is probably going to hammer this home a little bit better than I would anyway in future presentation. But the idea is once these nutrients and contaminants that we've introduced through development reach into the lake systems, what we're doing is we're creating these algae blooms that we see within the lakes. We're creating organic precipitation fallout down onto the bottom, introducing more plant growth. Essentially, eutrophication is a natural process. It's going to happen within the lake systems. But when we introduce phosphorus and nitrogen, we're basically feeding it steroids, and we're accelerating everything. So the idea is we got to cut that off, whether it be through septic redesign, introduction of wastewater treatment plants, or what we do at the corporation, introduction of stormwater retrofits to catch it all. So in this diagram I like because it shows an exact example of what I'm trying to hit on. And it gives a good model of the different points where we can introduce stormwater treatment locally within our own residence, but also more regionally with the introduction of larger stormwater projects that can occur. So as rainfall hits our homes, our roof systems, we have the opportunity to catch it right at the gutter, get it into the ground and treat it. A smaller practice, meaning a dry well that many of you may already have at home. Or in some developments which they just weren't included when they first went in. There's also opportunities to put small rain garden systems, biofiltration systems in. The idea being, let's get that water in the ground and get it off of our pavement, off of our roads, stop it from ever reaching the catch basins. Because as you guys can probably experience over the last decade, surely, the more water we let hit our catch basin systems, the more flooding we're getting. Storms are getting more intense. They're getting harder to manage. They're getting harder to design for, which is becoming a greater and greater problem throughout, especially throughout the Northeast, from what I've seen. But it's getting hard to catch up with the rainfall data as it occurs because these systems are so strong. But this, once we get past the home itself, we have the opportunity to load something at maybe curbside, where we can catch things from our driveway, anything that's flowing off of the lawn, any fertilizer that got used when we tried to do our lawn over the weekend. That's getting right into the catch basins, and it's going directly into the lake. So another tool is simply cutting off that fertilizer and tolerating a couple of dandelions, maybe. But this is a great opportunity at curbside to drop a system or some type of treatment practice. Next would be right into the catch basin. which can get tricky, but there are plenty of filtration devices that can be put directly into our catch basin systems if that's the right application for your site. Lastly is trying to grab something at the pipe. Now, for you folks within lake communities, that's awfully hard to do because, I would call it overdevelopment in the past, where there aren't a lot of opportunities where these pipes are going. They're going right directly next to your lakes, your ponds, your streams. And more likely than not, there's already a house there. There's already a right-of-way space, a swimming space that we're not going to be able to get into. So that's, for you folks, I don't know that that's the right solution that could ever be applied, but there certainly could be opportunities there. For us, through the retrofit program, we tackled that spot a lot, where you would see larger wetland systems, pond systems that can capture that 25-acre discharge point. But what we're finding as we've advanced the program is those opportunities are few and far between now. Now we got to start looking at smaller practices. Instead of one big one, we might end up with 100 smaller individual-sized systems that I think hit home a little bit more for this type of community. So when we design everything within the program, there's two different types of storms that we look at. One's the water quality storm, one's the water quantity. That quantity storm is that flood that comes through and just get it out of the way, get it off the roads, and we try not to do much with it. Because it's the water quantity storm that represents 90% of the rainfall that occurs in any given year. That's the one that's carrying the pollutants for the most part. That's the one that's carrying the first flush of contaminants that come off the road. That's the one that we got to grab and try to treat within the program. So here's just a list of a few of the quick practices. I'm going to jump right into some photos of them. But as I said, on the larger scale, we could have stormwater ponds, stormwater wetlands, systems that could take up maybe an acre of property within themselves. But they're great tools to tackle those 25-acre drainage areas, 5-acre drainage areas even. And they introduce some new natural environments for vegetation to grow, for animals to come back, pond turtles, ducks, you name it. We have a lot of ponds that we've implemented through the watershed that have really introduced a really nice aesthetic that we have a lot of pride upon. After that, there's the infiltration practices, which, as I pointed out earlier, is by far the best bang for the buck. Get the water, put it back in the ground. That's our best way to try to get back to that original hydrologic cycle that was in place when it was all forested, no development. Just get the water back in the ground, best way to treat it, recharge the water table. After that are the filtering practices, which is a large spectrum of different types of things that can occur. Those are the rain gardens, perhaps. Those might be the chamber designs that have filter practices within a chamber that the water flows through. So we can have a lot of good aesthetic value from filtering practices like rain gardens or bioinfiltration. You'll hear me use that term bioinfiltration a lot, which essentially, you're probably more familiar with the rain garden term. It's the same thing. The idea being just a garden that grabs that water, gets it into the ground, but can provide a little bit of more aesthetic for a homeowner. Lastly are the open channel practices that we've implemented, which are the large drainage channels that you might have running down a hillside. From that pipe empties out and it takes the full brunt of your entire drainage area that then wipes out and creates a crater going through somebody's yard, somebody's right-of-way. For us, we've seen a lot of spots where it's been as wide as 20 feet, as deep as 10 feet, where we got to spend a lot of time cleaning up that. And with those channels, it's the sediment load that really gets to damaging the lakes and the streams. We'll find that there are areas that, I know of one property in Putnam Lake that did not have an acre lawn in front of them, that now does, because the amount of sediment that's traveled in from the state of Connecticut can found our way into the lake. So these can be very damaging practices that we like to fix. We can fix those through simple riprap, introduction of rock to stabilize the slopes so we don't see any further erosion. Or pipe systems, which carry their own problems of maintenance, but it's still solid options for the future. Here, I wanted to just hit on and acknowledge a couple of the lakes that we've been working with over the last 10 years, and a few that we'll be starting with in the future. Each of these lakes have introduced a different challenge, I would say. There are some that we're able to install multiple large ponds at, like Lake Carmel. There are some that we're still working on today to try to find a solution because of, say, a high water table or high level of rock. For instance, Pine Pond has high rock and ledge in many areas, so it's not as easy as coming up with a standard solution to implement. You got to think about it and make sure to get the right practice that's going to fit the community. So with all these lakes, we've advanced different options. Many already installed, many we're still putting into place. These are the stormwater ponds and wetlands that you often see right on the edge of the lake systems. I believe these are just stock photos, but this one in particular on the right is very similar to a practice that we installed at Lake Carmel in Kent. We have 3 of these practices, which are in series, right along Lake Shore Drive, I believe, and can be very successful as long as they're maintained properly and cleaned out regularly. They've served as a great spot for that all the sediment and phosphorus eventually settle out. This stormwater wetland was a practice that was implemented at Lake Waterbuck on 3 Lakes Council property, and this was in conjunction with the town of Lewisboro. Introduced a beautiful wetland system that wildlife were able to return to and thrive in. Infiltration practices, I touched on maybe a dry well right at that downspout of your homes and the downspout of your roofs. Particularly, what I wanted to point out was the opportunity for a lot of lakes when you folks have let's say a beachfront right-of-way space, parking space that's already being used. Currently, it's a dirt patch, most likely, undeveloped. It's a great opportunity to get maybe an infiltration practice right there, pavers on top of it, to resemble something more like this. That space up top started probably looking like this at first. You got some of these chambers installed inside, lined with gravel. Pavers go on top. Now all the maintenance for this, all we're doing is sweeping the top and maybe a vac truck that'll come in and suck out any sediment that gets into a control device on site. So it's a great opportunity. We'll do questions at the end if you don't mind. Great opportunity to try to introduce a treatment practice right lakeshore, and it's going to provide you with a little bit of stability for the community itself. Again, these are all practices that, when integrated into the program that we run with Eastern Hudson Watershed Corporation, become fully funded. As long as we find the right fit and we find the right investment that we can make, these are all practices that I think we can team up with. Filtering practices, as I said, there's just a large spectrum of different types of things we can do. There's chamber units that can go right at the end of pipe. Water just flows right through the filtration devices that get put in place. Every company's got a different brand. Every brand's got a different feel to it and maintenance requirements, so it's just a matter of finding the right one that fits for that particular downspout. The bottom right and top left are very similar practices, both bioinfiltration. This is your typical rain garden right at the side of the road. This is a bioinfiltration practice that likely was installed within a Stop and Shop on any kind of development these days. You see a lot of green infrastructure, which introduces a lot of treatment options that can fit more nicely into the aesthetic of the communities. And last at the bottom, this is just a typical hydrodynamic separator, which is a small unit that can go in. You don't get a lot of removal ability for it, but it's better than nothing, for sure. And it definitely gives a very small footprint and gives you the ability to hit on all these requirements that New York State's introduced for the communities. And over channel flows, you'll see these almost all the time on 84. They used to be bright white riprap that probably caused a whole bunch of car accidents within the last 5 years. But now it's just a more natural flow and an ability to move those water quantity storms, those larger storms, away from the developed areas. If they're done right, then you get the opportunity to provide some treatment through a ground bed, vegetation, that all adds to the additional removal process. So once these practices go in, what's next? And something I like to try to hammer home with anyone that I'm speaking with is, this is a long-term commitment. When the corporation goes and does a retrofit project, we have to sign an installation agreement with all individuals that have deeded rights to the area that we're installing the practice. And part of that commitment is, as long as the permit is required for New York State, we have to go in and make sure these items get maintained. If it's not us, then it would even be you if you're doing something locally yourselves, funding it yourselves to try to tackle these things. There is not a practice out there that is set it and forget it. Every single practice needs some type of care. So when selecting a stormwater treatment option, you have to have that in mind, that you want to try to find something that, yes, is going to give you your reduction requirement, but you're actually going to be able to take care of it too. You know, you're actually going to be able to organize as a community to touch on the project. And maybe it's an organized community day where you all go out, replace the plantings within a bioretention area, and remove the mulch. It's something that you don't have to hire an outside contractor to come in for, but you can handle yourselves. Different ways to try to set these up is by looking at them as public utility fees or special tax districts. I myself run a tax district for my community in Connecticut. Now, we're not a lake community, but just a local private road system, but we have the entire area taxed, so we can address all maintenance for the road, whether it's stormwater options, which everybody's tired of hearing from me, or it's plowing the roads, fixing the area up. But it's an option that's out there, and it's always best to try to put these types of practices in place before you have the problem. Because if you're trying to tax it now, and try to come up with a solution now, it takes years to build up that revenue and that funding to address these items. You have to try to plan ahead, even 5-10 years down the road, to put these practices in place so that you have the ability to do a larger project and not feel like you're underfunded. It's engaging everybody around you in your community, within your lake. It's teaching people that you can't mow the lawn and then blow all the clippings right into a catch basin. You can't walk your dog and drop the baggie into the catch basin. It's just simple things that can really have an effect on postings around your lake community in the common areas that you have. It's handing out pamphlets, having the discussion of, hey, it's not that you're doing it wrong, but maybe there's a better way that we could do this that won't impact the lake. And it's just little tweaks in everybody's daily activity that can get there. What we've been trying to do is roll out more and more of these signs throughout our project areas to try to serve as teaching tools for the community as they come through. We've got a lot of park projects that we're trying to incorporate these more because, it's great that you folks come to a meeting like this and that you're engaged in trying to find solutions for your lakes, but not everybody is. A lot of times it's, they'll know what to do if you tell them and you teach them, but they might not be chasing after the answer themselves. So opportunities like that to just put something right in front of people's faces to catch their attention can go a long way. Okay, so how can you guys afford these things? There's lots of options, as I said, not lots, but there are some options available. The special tax districts, I think, are a great way that you can put in place and immediately start having revenue coming in for you, and setting up a constant flow of funding that can come in that can be used for maintenance, maybe primarily. The stormwater management utility funds are very similar to that. Personally, I'm trying to push those a little bit more with the local municipalities and local town representatives to try to put these things in place. Because again, you get those in early, you start building up the funds for the entire community, and then there's money available in the future. State and federal grants that can come down. Every year there's a new wave of grants that come through. Every year it's different. The requirements are just slightly different, targeted differently, but there's always something available out there. So I want to hit on some of the state and federal grants that are available right now. And there's a reason why I have a very small description here. And the bad news is, right now, the wave of grants that are coming out are targeted very specifically to underserved communities. And they often call them environmental justice areas. It's areas where, for the past, say, 100 years, the federal government and state governments have not been putting funding necessarily. It's areas that don't have treatment practices and don't have availability currently to treat their stormwater. And given our region, now I'm making assumptions on the group here, but given our region, within the East Hudson watershed particularly, we do not qualify for any federal or state grants, which is based off of the average income of the communities. There's certain thresholds you have to meet in order to qualify for these. I've had a staff member picking apart every single grant we can to try to capture anything. And unfortunately, right now, we just don't have anything that we're eligible for. There's one street in Mount Kisco, and I'm not even joking, one street in the village of Mount Kisco that I could use funding for, and that's not enough, to say the least. So that brings us to me, the East Hudson Watershed Corporation. We are still funded by New York State and by New York City DEP. That funding isn't going away because New York City has to clean up their drinking water supply. It will vary, it'll come in different waves, but the funding is still available. My requirements for funding within the corporation are much lower. And simply, we need to have something that can work, a project that can be efficient, that can help the community and help the municipalities meet their New York State regulated laws and goals that they have to have. So if it's a project that's going to fit with us, we are in. We're interested and we want to hear from you folks. As we move forward, we just wrapped up the first 10-year cycle of the program, and I'm just going to check my watch, make sure I'm not affecting anybody. Okay. So we just wrapped up our first 10 years of the program. New York State is getting ready to roll out another 10 years. With that next 10 years, we're going to have more funding made available to us. I don't know what that number will be, but I can tell you that as we've hit a lot of the projects in the areas, we've done a lot of the big, obvious ones already. And we're going to start engaging more and more with smaller communities to figure out how we can help you folk and have more of an impact locally. Because we've done everything we can with those large 25-acre, 5-acre ponds. Now it's time to start thinking small and try to hit everybody. Moving forward, we'll have an expansion of the East Hudson Watershed Corporation to wastewater design and repair. We're getting ready to launch a study into the entire watershed to figure out what areas need the most attention, what technology would be the best fit. A lot of the items that Rachel hit on previously in the last presentation, I think, are vital to that study that we have going forward. It's going to be septic repairs, maybe a local hookup. But we have to do a full study to figure out what all the communities need, what's the best way to engage with all of you, and then we can figure out how to fund it and what's going to be the best way to tackle those issues. But that's in its infant stages. But I see that even just recently within the last year, the corporation is taking that on internally, and we'll be looking to engage with all of you as we move forward. To that point, if anybody has lake studies that they've already accomplished, if anybody has general septic studies for their areas they've already accomplished, those types of information, if it's brought to us, would be vital as we try to shape what's going on. I am available for conversation on any of those topics and more than happy to figure out what you guys already have that can help us get to the end goal And I'd be happy to stick around, answer additional questions that you might have for where we're going, and what might be the right solution for you guys. We've already hit on a lot of lake communities, but there's more out there. And trust me, I'm working with a lot of the town supervisors to figure out what else we can do for everybody. But I think I'm running a little bit low on time, so if there are any specific questions, I'll be happy to jump into them. And then I'll be sticking around a bit later, because I know there'll probably be more flooding. Yes, miss.
When you had that slide at the beginning with the listing of ponds and that, I noticed like Scarsdale, New Rochelle, Eastchester, none of them were in that list. How do you get in that list?
So the list was defined by the New York City DEP. That the border that flowed around that list was literally the top of the mountain. So everything that flowed on within one side was water that flowed to the reservoir systems that feed New York City's drinking water supply. If anything on the outside of the line would be systems that likely are water flow that would likely reach the Hudson River. In southern Westchester, I would think that it would find its way towards Rye and New Rochelle and likely out towards I-95. So there's no way to get it. If you're not within that already, there's just no way to accomplish that, unfortunately. But there are, once you get into southern Westchester, there might be more availability towards the other grants and the other federal options that are available out there. I didn't do research into those areas, particularly myself, but again, if you were to look at environmental justice mapping and search for that, that's a tool that you literally can drop in your address and find out whether or not you're in a jurisdiction that might have funding available. Yes, sir.
What's the best practice where the road, the county road, is right next to the lake, and the drains are on the other side of the road? The lake is on, opposite sides, but the drains go into the lake.
Not a lot of space.
Not a lot of space there.
Yeah.
It's, the paved road.
Sure. Depending on the road, what's something that we use there a lot that brings to mind Lake Napac specifically, where we have a project going in on Marina Drive, and then the county road as it goes past the southeast end of it, and we're looking at doing catch basin filters, which are dropping right into the catch basins. They remove about 50% of phosphorus and nitrogen that come through. These products can have an extremely small footprint into literally the catch basin itself, and there's not a lot of options after that, unfortunately, as you're kind of alluding to. But we're still looking through and trying to find some more opportunities that are out there. I do believe that the inserts are a great way to do that. Depending on where your pipe is that comes off that road, another great option might be the rain garden, so bioinfiltration, because you could maybe, as that pipe comes out, you can grab it, put it right into a treatment practice, and then redirect it back into its original outflow. Last question. Okay. Listen.
Do you do testing before and after you do one of these remediation practices, and can you actually measure how much phosphorus you
It's not a requirement for us to do the testing, and therefore we do not have the funding to do the testing. All of it is based off of state and city phosphorus loading requirements that we have in place already. So I think that is vital information. However, unfortunately, we don't have the ability to do that yet.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt. Okay, please join me in thanking Kevin for this. Next, we have a break. So I want you back here at 10:50.
We are going to try really hard to stay on time, and that's one of the ways we can do it. So, the first presentation for the late morning is somebody I have come to know quite well in the last 3 years, and it is a great pleasure to know A.J. Reyes. A.J. actually grew up in Putnam Valley, which for those of you who don't know is just BS in ecology from SUNY Plattsburgh in 2008, and his master's in lake management from SUNY Oneonta in 2016. And he worked with U.S. Geological Survey in lakes all over the United States. Lakes in places as different as Montana, Alaska, Nevada, North Carolina. He has hands-on experience dealing with very difficult lake problems. Quagga mussels in the Hoover Dam, invasive trout in Yellowstone Lake, hydrilla in North Carolina. So the fact that he's here now working in these local lakes is wonderful for us. He's part of a rising generation of young, hands-on lake managers. He loves good data, but he also is committed to knowing the lake from paddling it, sampling it, examining its plants, its fish, and its microscopic creatures. We are glad AJ has the experience that he does of many lakes all over the country, but we're even more glad that he's come back to the lakes of his childhood. Thank you.
I don't even know what to say. Thank you. So I wanted to choose this particular topic, and when we were talking about what we wanted to talk about with Maureen and a few of the different members of the committee, I wanted to really touch on the internal loading aspect of lakes because it's, in our opinion, I'm speaking not just for me also, but some of the other lake managers in the U.S., internal loading in lakes is probably one of the most important processes that happens, and especially for harmful algae blooms, and I'll talk about all that. However, it can be a difficult topic to grasp, and it's not like a septic system, or it's not like stormwater. I think if you guys were in this area yesterday, you saw all the water flowing down from different areas. That stuff is very easy to see and very visual, and it's not that hard of a leap to kind of say, all right, you have this groundwater flowing down from a particular area, or you have a septic system that is potentially malfunctioning or has failed, and that is impacting the lake. However, with internal loading, that's not really the case. So I wanted to spend some time and talk about this often under-talked about, but extremely important process that happens in lakes. So, very simple, we're going to be talking about phosphorus, our favorite element. I know you guys have heard about that a lot, but I'm going to go into some of the basics of that, and also external loading. We're also going to talk about what is internal loading and how do we manage it. So, kind of disclaimer here. This is an extremely complicated topic with a lot of different processes going on, both in the biological, the physical, geological, and the chemical. So I'm not going to be touching on every single little process. There's things that we're going to be leaving out. There's things we're going to be glossing over. I'm more than happy to talk about that later, but it really is an in-depth topic. So what I would like for the group to do is really focus on these three main questions here. And that's what I would like you to get out of this talk. What is internal loading? Why is internal loading important? And what techniques are out there to control this internal loading? So, oftentimes as lake managers, avoiding this particular scenario is sort of the end game for everything that we do in these lakes. Even if a lake brings me in or another lake manager in to work upon aquatic plant issues, we are always keeping harmful algae blooms in the back of our mind. They don't just represent an aesthetic problem for lakes in terms of the visual value of either property values or just nobody wants them to see a pea soup clean area. They also have tremendous health impacts, as I know the health department will talk about in a little bit, and they really impact every part of the lake. So when we talk about harmful algae blooms, just growth in lakes in general, phosphorus is generally considered to be the main culprit. If you have higher phosphorus levels, more likely than not, you have higher algae. Once again, there's nuance in all of this. There's ratios between phosphorus and nitrogen, that forms of phosphorus that are in the lake, that all play into this. However, generally, if you reduce your phosphorus in your lake, you will reduce your algae blooms. And algae blooms in general are usually fueled by one of three in sort of these combinations of light, heat, and nutrients. That's why oftentimes you see blooms during the summer and not during winter. However, in the winter, they can happen. There's blooms that happen under the ice. I've worked on lakes that have had a full lake bloom in the end of December. It is, once again, a lot of these rules are not hard and fast. There's a lot of play in a lot of this. But generally, light, heat, and nutrients are what drive algae growth. And what the general paradigm is reducing phosphorus equals reducing algae blooms. A lot of this I know you guys have probably heard of. Phosphorus, once again, is it's a very common thing here at a lot of these conferences. So the last two talks did a great job of explaining both, kind of together two of the main external loading sources. And when I say external loading, I mean all of the different phosphorus, nitrogen, and even organic matter and inorganic sediments that are moving towards the lake at some point, right? So you have your septic systems, which if they're not functioning properly, will push nitrogen and phosphorus and other organic material either into the groundwater or overland flow into the lake. You also have stormwater, which picks up all the pollutants that are accumulated on your impervious surfaces, both in individual homes and gutters, but also on larger county and state roads, and pushing it all towards the lake. Now, every lake is receiving a load of some kind. Even a lake that has no development around entirely, that has no roads, either paved or unpaved in the watershed, they're all receiving some material. The leaves that are falling off the lake. Even if you have a pristine stream, there are, a storm event can maybe dislodge a few rocks, and that gravel and fine materials could move into the lake. However, the thing that we're worried about is that the human development in a lot of these watersheds has accelerated this process. You have more impervious surface, more nutrients and pollutants move through. When you have more septic systems within a watershed, you have more opportunity for that potential untreated wastewater, or partially treated if it's going through a leach field, to enter the lake. So as human development increases, we see this increase in nutrients and particularly phosphorus. So the big takeaway here is that lakes do accumulate their phosphorus from the watershed. Again, very pretty basic stuff for anyone who's heard these talks before.
It's okay.
So this is where we're going to diverge into sort of building up the idea of what the internal load is. So what happens to all these nutrients when they actually, or the sediment, when they actually enter the lake? Well, is once again a little bit of oversimplification, but there's kind of two processes that go on. So some of those nutrients, I'm talking about phosphorus and algae, can be directly uptaked by algae and bacteria. We oftentimes refer to this as the soluble fraction. So this is phosphorus and nitrogen that is not bound to any organic material. It is just floating around in the lake, and algae are directly available to uptake it. A lot of, if you have an on-site wastewater problem, a large proportion of that water that is coming from an on-site wastewater is in the soluble fraction. Conversely, stormwater, which you see the brown waters, there's a large proportion of that is actually particulate, that is bound to small clays, bound to, let's say, leaves and silt, and oftentimes it will actually settle right to the bottom when it comes out, when it comes out into the lake. Now, once again, those things get transformed. It's not 100% that you just have some that is directly to the algae and some right to the bottom. But that's kind of the general process here. And the thing I want you to take away from this slide here is lakes, when it comes to the amount of nutrients that come in, they are not flow-through systems. The amount of nutrients that come into a lake are not exactly what goes out of the lake. These lakes are accumulators. They're not flow-through, right? It's not like a pipe where you have one concentration on the end, it just comes in and then it flows out the other side. They keep accumulating over thousands and thousands of years. If you have any lakes that, let's say have a large wetland contingent, wetlands are constantly accumulating organic material, and every lake really is. This is one of the morbid truths about lakes, that all lakes will fill in at some point. It may be in 20,000 years, it may be in 150 years, but every lake is moving towards a wetland and will move towards a forest. An important thing for phosphorus is that some phosphorus leaves the lake, but a lot of it can get retained, and this is where we talk about a concept called phosphorus retention. So, what happens to this phosphorus when it's retained? Does it just stay in the sediment? Maybe I'm just doing a little foreshadowing here. So, what I would call the unseen adversary is basically the culmination of all of this external load that has not left the lake, but is also kind of settled to the bottom. Now, once again, this includes, your stormwater outflows, your on-site wastewater outflows, but this also includes any algae that is grown in the lake right now. So right now, currently, right on China Pond, there's algae growing and dying constantly, and constantly some of it's staying up in the water column based on wind and entrainment, but also some of it's dropping out into the bottom waters. So when you get to these accumulated mucks on the bottom, this is a picture of a local lake, the bottom of the lake, where it has this dark black muck that's kind of rich in organic material, also rich in a whole bunch of other nutrients, and as you could guess, phosphorus. They can vary in organic and metal composition. Normally, these sediments exist probably, anywhere from 15 to 25% organic. It's actually not as organic as you would normally think, and that actually has implications for different management techniques, as we'll talk about. But the important thing to remember too about this is that it's full of bacteria, and I want you to remember that because bacteria probably are, if not the most important organism in your lake, it's really far up there. So the other thing too is that there is a lot more phosphorus and nitrogen in the sediments than overlying waters. Sometimes we see measurements of 5,000 milligrams per kilogram of phosphorus in the sediments versus sometimes we see 100 times less than that in the overlying water column. So it's a really, really large source of phosphorus that normally nobody knows about. You just stay down there. Maybe if you put an anchor down and you pull it up and you see some of this black muck, you're like, oh yeah, well, it's just muck, and I clean their anchor off and move on. But this is extremely important. And in terms of phosphorus, phosphorus exists in many different forms within the sediment. Some phosphorus is bound to iron, which is very important. Some is loosely bound to some to different mineral complexes. Some are bound to aluminum and calcium. Some is also bound to the organic phosphorus. And I put these in different sizes just because this is sort of generally the proportions of what you'll see in the lake, but every lake is different in terms of where that phosphorus is. Now, a portion of this phosphorus can be directly available for algae growth during the season. So some of this will probably never come out of the sediment. It'll just stay there. But the other parts we're concerned about, especially the iron-bound phosphorus and the organic-bound phosphorus, those two can actually become concerning. So, lakes are inherently a balance between photosynthesis and respiration. So we're going back to introductory biology, but most plants and algae will produce oxygen during the summertime and during the daytime, which is as a consequence of photosynthesis. And usually this is happening in the surface waters of lakes, where you have sufficient light that is penetrating down and also heat that is penetrating down at this particular time. However, on the bottom of these lakes, where you have this no light, where this muck is existing, there is very, very little light, and usually respiration is dominating, so just like we are doing right now. The vast majority of the respiration happening in these lakes is done via the bacteria that's in these sediments. And there's a lot of bacteria in the sediment. Sometimes I've seen numbers of like 10 million per meter squared or even more than that. I mean, there is a ton of bacteria down there. And what happens is that during the summer, when lakes sort of stratify, when the surface waters warm up disproportionately to the bottom, which creates a difference in density, these bottom waters get cut off from the surface and they get cut off from the supply of oxygen. So it's not even good enough that there's no light down there, which is not producing any photosynthesis. No oxygen is actually transferring down into those bottom waters. So when you have this and you have all this respiration, you start to get a depletion of oxygen. Now, every lake is different in terms of when it will actually get to the point of zero oxygen. Some lakes don't get there until July and August. Some will get there in April. It all depends on the status of your lake, the amount of nutrients, and the amount of organic material on the bottom. So basically the takeaway here is there is oxygen depletion at the bottom of the lakes, which is mediated by this bacteria, and that bacteria is breaking down that same muck that I mentioned in the previous slide. So, to put this all together, as we mentioned before, the external load contributes organic and inorganic matter to the lake. Once again, it is accelerated by human use, but every lake is experiencing this. The load, part of the load, and I should wrote part of the load here, settles to the bottom and forms nutrient-rich sediments, right? So your leaves, even the fish and the zooplankton that die off are doing this as well. Your stormwater inputs, it's all, a large portion of it is going to the bottom, and it's staying at the bottom. At the same time, the low light conditions and the high bacterial decomposition take that oxygen concentration, which is very important, but drives it all the way down because there's nothing to replenish it on that bottom. And then the new part that we haven't talked about yet is what actually happens in the sediment. So inside of the sediments, you have this interaction between iron and phosphorus. And I mentioned before, iron is bound to phosphorus, and in most sediments, it's the most common way that phosphorus is bound. When there is oxygen present, it is bound in what we call the ferric form. And then there's some advanced chemistry with reduction reactions and oxidation reduction, that when there is no oxygen, the ferric iron gets reduced to ferrous iron. And what that ends up doing is it takes that phosphorus that is normally bound and just staying in the iron and just staying there and not doing anything, and it breaks it up. And that phosphorus is now free and open to do whatever it wants to do. And oftentimes, it is in an area where the algae can sort of take advantage of it. So that's not the only thing that's happening in the sediment. There's a lot of transformations of ammonia, of hydrogen sulfide, iron, manganese. A lot of drinking water reservoirs deal with this issue because iron and manganese are not good for drinking water standards. So reservoirs that are pulling water out and trying to have clean water usually have to deal with this. Really, it's less about the phosphorus, it's more about the manganese and such. And there's also hydrogen sulfide. So if there's any CSLAP volunteers in here that have taken deep water samples and smelled hydrogen sulfide, I know China is definitely one that has it, and Barrett as well. There's a few other lakes in the area. I know Mayapack, I've seen that on there before. That's a consequence of this internal loading process. So external load contributes organic matter. It settles to the bottom. The conditions on the bottom allow for low oxygen, which helps release phosphorus. Does that all make sense? I'm glossing over a lot here, but the important part, once again, to remember is that it is readily available for algae use when it is released. So, a little cartoon here. Hopefully it all works well. I think it will. Not a link, so I think it should be all right. So, kind of to sum up what we were talking about here, all lakes in some varying aspects in this area have some sort of contribution from all of these different sources. I didn't touch on atmospheric deposition of waterfowl before when we first spoke about it, but that can definitely be a contribution. Waterfowl usually isn't a major contributor unless your lake is really shallow and you have, we're getting to like the thousands of geese and a lot of them being residents. It's not to say you shouldn't do geese management and such, but oftentimes in larger lakes, it's not the driving factor behind increased nutrients in the lakes unless those very specific situations. But all of these sources contribute nutrients to the lake, both phosphorus and nitrogen, right? Some end up in the water column, but some go right to the sediment, as we talked about before. So this will grow and this will stimulate algae growth in the lake. Now, what happens, as I mentioned before, that's happening in every lake at every single moment is algae is growing and dying. And the part that is dying is going all the way down to the sediment. And when this algae is dying, combining that with what's happening in the bottom in terms of the bacteria consuming and expiring at the bottom, you get this zone of no oxygen that's happening at the bottom. And what ends up happening is you get a release of all of these different compounds into the water. And as I mentioned, you also have ammonia. And ammonia is actually important to know because normally in lakes, we don't think about nitrogen as a major driver of cyanobacteria blooms in most of our lakes. However, ammonia is a readily available source of nitrogen for cyanobacteria. So it's also important to measure ammonia and think about ammonia on these bottom of the lakes. You also have iron, which is a micronutrient for cyanobacteria as well, and then manganese and sulfur, and there's a few other things that will come out as well. And once again, the transport of these elements from the bottom of the sediments up into the water column is termed the internal load. So, why does this matter? I just went through a nice little chemistry session, and some people may be like, oh, this is whatever about this, but the internal load is extremely significant in lakes. Every single lake, every lake that every lake that's represented in here has internal loading at some level, even if you have no oxygen loss. There's a lake over in Cortland, Maine called Lake Meog, which is about 88 feet, and it has about 4 feet deep. It still has internal loading. It's not through the process that I mentioned, but it's still having internal loading. So it happens in every single lake. The other problem is that the timing of the internal load coincides with other favorable algae conditions. It's happening most often during the summer when you have high light and high heat. As I mentioned, readily available forms of phosphorus. Sometimes watershed loads can be reduced during that summertime. You may not have the same sort of high flows that are coming from, from the spring runoff, so it can actually increase the importance. So the point is, the big question is, what can we actually do about this internal load? So there's three basic ways that managers try and address the internal load. It's removing the sediment or the water, binding the phosphorus so it's not released, and then potentially improving the oxygen conditions at the bottom. So the first technique we're going to touch on really quickly, combination of techniques, is the dredging hyperlink withdrawal. Basically, the big concept here is that if the sediments are causing the problem, why don't we just take them out? And any lake manager will tell you if permits are not an issue and money were not an issue, this would be the #1 thing that every lake manager would recommend to fix the lake. However, permits are something to worry about, and also money is also something to worry about. And oftentimes, dredging is extremely cost intensive, especially to dredge enough sediment to really make a difference in the internal load. So it is very rarely recommended for this. And you also have hyperlink withdrawal, which is a very specific technique that removes bad water from the bottom of the lake. Your lake can really only do this unless if it has a great existing structure at the bottom to pull water out. It can work, however, there can be some significant downstream impacts. As I mentioned before, there's a bunch of bad water down there, so just because you don't want it doesn't mean your downstream neighbor wants it as well. So usually that's a very site-specific technique. So probably what is considered by managers to be between cost and longevity is probably the most effective technique we've seen for managing the internal load is actually binding the phosphorus. So there's a ton of different materials out there that bind phosphorus and will keep it in the sediments and not allow it to come back out. The two that we normally talk about are aluminum sulfate and then the lanthanum modified bentonite, which is most commonly known as phosphate. What they do is they take that phosphorus and they bind it together, and they do not allow it to be reintroduced into the water, even under anoxic oxygen poor conditions. It can be applied as a slurry or a liquid. Actually, aluminum is used all over the state in wastewater applications to reduce the amount of phosphorus that comes out after treatment. And what we've seen in a lot of these different lakes is the longevity of the treatment varies, but some lakes have seen over 20 years of phosphorus control using some sort of a nutrient method. As your lake gets shallower and your watershed gets larger, that longevity usually decreases. But it is a technique that is very well proven over multiple decades. So I want to mention circulation, and I'm also going to talk about aeration at the same time here. The next idea is, all right, can we put oxygen down at the bottom of the lake to be able to stop that whole reaction from happening? And one of the most common ways to do this for people is to put some sort of a circulation system. Once again, this is another technique which we could do a whole 8-hour session on, just the ins and outs of this. But the idea is that you put these circulating diffusers on the bottom, and they're pushing air, not pure oxygen, they're pushing air from the bottom up into the surface, and the movement of that water is actually increasing contact with the atmosphere and increasing oxygen. The big issue with these is that undersizing is always a problem. You always need more diffusers than you think, and a lot of groups want to, are not really willing to pay for that, and then the case studies really are inconsistent with the results, and I can get into the reason why at a later time. Aeration, once again, you're trying to increase the oxygen, but instead of using air to increase the oxygen, you're actually using either pure oxygen or supersaturating the water and putting it back into the bottom of the lake. This is very common in drinking water applications. We've started to see some advances for shallower lakes, because a lot of this stuff really is, we're talking lakes that are greater than 30 meters deep. So we are starting to see some increases in potential utility, especially with the side stream supersaturation technique, but it's still limited in its infancy. So, conclusions, once again, this is intended to be just a basic introduction to internal loading. It's a regeneration of nutrients from the sediment back into the water column. It's important to remember that the ultimate source of phosphorus is still from your watershed. So this is not a talk that's saying, oh, don't worry about your watershed. Yes, we still need to manage the watersheds. We still need to manage our septic systems. It's just important to realize that that is not the main and only driver of algae blooms. And we do have different techniques that are available to manage it. Each have their pros and cons, and each are going to be useful in some situations and not. But one more thing I'll say is it cannot be ignored in lakes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AJ, and thank you for staying on time. We have 2 talks now on a subject that all of us, I think, are very concerned about, which is harmful algal blooms, HABs. And we're going to be privileged to hear first from Rebecca Gormy. Rebecca received her PhD in Natural Resource Management from the University of Vermont. She's worked in New York City's urban forests, Hawaii's rainforests, and alpine Colorado lakes. Her recent work at the DEC includes expanding the agency's efforts regarding HAB research, mitigation, and outreach efforts. She's a research scientist with the DEC. And we're particularly happy to welcome her here today because we are very pleased that she is now going to be heading up the CSLAP division of the DEC. So we welcome Rebecca, and I'm not going to interrupt with another introduction, but following her talk will be Vincent Corinne, who I've known for many years now because he comes by and inspects our lake just down the road. And Vincent is a public health sanitarian with the Putnam County Department of Health, and he's worked in the public beach program for the past 14 years, and he's been involved with the blue-green algae response since 2013 when it started. So welcome to Rebecca first.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so excited that so many of you are here, and I am humbled to be the only DEC person here, and I just wanted to take a minute to recognize, there's been several mentions this morning about the state and permits and what's allowed and what's not, and what's funding opportunities. There is quite a lot of resources available, both from my office in Albany and from your regional office in New Paltz, the Region 3 office, and I would really encourage, before you undertake any major projects, to reach out and get more information to supplement what you're learning today from the state side as well. And I can answer questions on that later, but right now I'm just going to be speaking about harmful algal blooms. I know they've already been mentioned a few times today, but we're going to dig in a little deeper on the background. It's an acronym that originated in the marine world with marine tides, red tides, and other organisms that live in ocean systems, but we've kind of co-opted it for freshwater. The harmful can refer to toxins, but not all HABs are toxic, and even if toxins are not present, there can be harmful impacts to economics, aesthetics, and ecological usages of water bodies. The algal is technically incorrect. Truly, these are bacteria, cyanobacteria. If you remember back to your high school biology, there's prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. These are the prokaryotic, the ancient organisms that are very simple, tiny, microscopic cells. And what we see here is a bloom. There's a lot of different ways to define a bloom. You can measure it by the amount of toxins present, the amount of cells present, the amount of chlorophyll present, or the overall conclusion is it's a dense proliferation of these cells. What we see here is likely billions and billions of cells, and there's a strong visual component. So that allows us to have the fastest response, is to rely on this visual recognition. This is something gross. People should stop using the water. So cyanobacteria is the technical scientific term. You may have heard them called blue-green algae previously. That's kind of a slightly outdated misnomer. They're not always blue or green. and HABs. I'll probably use all three of these throughout my short talk. All of them refer to this ancient bacteria. They're not invasive species. They've been on the planet for billions of years and are likely in every lake in New York already. They're not going anywhere. They thrive in warm temperatures, sunny, high light concentrations, and high nutrient loads. That is not to say they will not occur in lakes with low nutrients. They do. They occur in all different types of water bodies. We understand the basic recipe here of the ingredients that they like, but in terms of where they'll occur, when they'll occur, how toxic they'll be, it's very difficult to predict. So it's a challenging topic to work on. This is what they look like under a microscope. So you can see they're very easy to differentiate. These are the three most common genera in New York State, and they look quite different under the microscope. Each little circle here is an individual cell. These lengthy ones are filamentous cells. The cells form colonies, so they gather together, but there's no structural integrity to them. They're just little floating cells. Some can fix nitrogen, similar to like your legumes or your pea plants. They can actually grab nitrogen from the air. They're not relying only on the nitrogen in the water. Some produce nerve toxins, others produce liver toxins. Those are mammalian impacts. We don't see a lot of impacts on birds or fish or reptiles. It's really the mammalian humans, pets, that are the most common impacts. This is actually a diagram of microcystin. It is a knot of hundreds of amino acids all woven together, and so you can imagine it takes a lot of, there can be a little, variance on this. I think after COVID, we all understand variance a little more, so there are like 200 different variants of microcystin. And antitoxins are less common. They're more kind of volatile. They come and go more quickly, but they tend to lead to instances of dogs consuming them. So dogs might swim in the water, they might eat a bunch of green growth, they might get it in their fur and then groom themselves, consume a bunch, and unfortunately the nerve toxins lead to pretty unpleasant fatalities. So some cyanobacteria produce microcystins and antitoxins some of the time, but all cyanobacteria have lipopolysaccharides, endotoxins, all of the time. So even if there are no toxins present, you can still have these skin irritants and dermal reactions. And that's the number one reason why our DEC and DOH, our approach to HABs in New York State is see a bloom, close a beach. See a bloom, call it a bloom, and consider people to recreate in areas where there's not a bloom. The skin reactions is our most commonly documented health endpoint, where somebody gets a skin rash that just sticks around for 2 weeks. And it's kind of like poison ivy, where some people might be extremely sensitive and other people might be virtually, immune. But do you really want to go and find out which class you fall into? I don't know. So there's no visual cues that toxins are present. A non-toxic bloom looks exactly the same as a toxic bloom. And we don't really know why or when toxins are produced. Further, this is just 2 classes of toxins. There are several others out there that we don't consistently monitor for because they're just not well understood and it's very expensive. So I already got to a bunch of this. This is, again, in conjunction with the Department of Health. Your 3 main routes of exposure are consumption, so that would be ingesting the water, maybe accidentally consuming it while you're swimming, particularly with kids, dogs. Inhalation is possible if you have, like the gentleman renting his jet ski in green water, where it's really high-powered shooting HABs laden water into the air. But we don't really understand the health endpoints of that as well. We don't know what the dosages are. It's a much less likely to lead to health impacts than consumption. And then the dermal occurrence would occur mostly through swimming. If you or anyone on your lake does think they have a health impact from contacting a HAB, they should contact their healthcare provider and let the county health department know. We keep track of these things. The symptoms can range from allergic type reactions, eye, nose, throat, skin, or GI type reactions, which would be more common in the ingestion route. There's a seasonal pattern in algal growth. AJ was mentioning a lot of nutrients become available, algae growing. Cyanobacteria are not the only algae in lakes. There are diatoms, there are golden algae or chrysophytes, there are dinoflagellates. There's a lot of different types of algae. In most lakes, there's a change over the course of the season, and the most common time that you'll see the cyanobacteria dominate is the late summer. That's when the zooplankton populations are the lowest, the water temperature is the highest. However, with climate change, this window is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. There are algal blooms throughout almost the entire year at this point. We have a few in Long Island that just never stop blooming. But the peak is really August 15th to September 15th. So really briefly, to know what you're looking at, anything that, my rule of thumb is that with that top photo, if you can pull it up with a stick or a pitchfork, or it's hairy or slimy or bubbly, it's probably not cyanobacteria. That's probably a green algae or some other type of plant growth. The cyanobacteria have no structural integrity, so you can't pick them up like that. Another commonly mistaken phenomenon is duckweed and watermeal. These are not algae, these are actually plants. They're the smallest plants on the planet. They have vascular structure, they have little roots. You can see the individual leaves, right? They're not microscopic, they're macroscopic. So those are not harmful. They're unpleasant maybe, but they're not toxic or harmful. And then pollen on the bottom slide, we're in it right now. This is pine trees dumping out right now, so we get a lot of HAB reports this time of year that we are mistaken for harmful algal blooms. More likely to be HABs are these types of appearances. It has a lot of different characteristics. It can be almost iridescent and oil slick-like, sometimes confused for petroleum products. If it's mixed into the whole water column, can have almost a pea soup, like a fully green appearance. If it's floating on the surface, it can be more like paint. Sometimes they can form little clumps, like the bottom image, maybe up to like a walnut size at most. But if you poked one of those with a stick, it would just disperse. It would not hold together. So we have some resources online that you can indulge yourself in to learn more. I have some hard copies of this reporting guide here that's like got color printed versions of those photos. Those are 3 different YouTube videos. I'm happy to share those links after, where you can teach yourself more. Our efforts statewide work very closely with the state parks and state and county Department of Health offices. We coordinate reporting of over 400 lakes in the state. CSLAP is a big component of that, but we have a lot of other HABs-focused programs as well. We refer any health concerns and drinking water treatment issues to local operators. So in this case, New York City DEP would be considered a local drinking water operator. And then the DOH works with them and other entities statewide to ensure that if there's a bloom on a water body that's used for treated drinking water, that they're adjusting their protocols for the bloom. And then there are hundreds of regulated swimming areas in the state. Vinny's going to talk more about these. And we have a protocol that is the same across all 3 agencies regarding closure. And then DEC works on a lot of mitigation efforts. AJ started speaking about some of those. We have done some pilot projects on emerging technologies. We have an extensive permitting program. There are substances, algicides, that are perfectly usable, and it just requires working with your local DEC office to get the right permit. And the clean water planning involves doing watershed, understanding what's coming into your lake from your watershed, and there's lots of funding available as well. I think I already covered a lot of this, but this really is our visual-based response. If you see a bloom, avoid a bloom. They can be very dynamic. They can come and go in a matter of hours. They don't stick around every year. Some lakes bloom every year, some lakes only bloom once. So here's kind of a summary of where we're at statewide. This map it's a couple years old, but you can see it's every part of the state. Sure, the Catskills and the Adirondacks have a few less, but not entirely absent. Obviously, Putnam County is pretty well covered. So the graph on the left, we have the total number of lakes that have ever had a documented HAB in New York State. Every year we get a few new places that we never saw one before. We've had over 500 in the last 10 years. But the next graph on the bottom shows how many get reported each year. So not every lake gets reported every year. And the number that we find has just stabilized. We're like really, really close. Remarkably consistent numbers the last few years. So it's not like an exponential growth, but it's also not going away. This is something we need to learn to live with. And then this last graph shows an even more unpredictable trend about how many beaches have closed statewide each year. This doesn't track as well with our reporting program. I don't have a great explanation for that. 2020 gets a little asterisk, obviously, because of COVID, but 2021, we were pretty much back to business as usual, and the numbers didn't skyrocket back up. They were similar to previous years. So we have developed a map reporting program. We're using a survey 123. That's a ArcGIS online program. It's a really, really short, easy, fillable form. You can do it on your phone or on a computer. And we require that a photo be attached, or 2 photos. And you can report a HAB on any lake using this form. For CSLAP participants, we have a slightly different form, which just has your CSLAP lake already plugged into the program. And then reports get submitted, we review them, and we put them up pretty much the next day on our map. So this is an interactive zoom in, zoom out map on NIHABs is the name of our platform. And it includes every HAB report in the state. Those within the last 2 weeks have the dark black circle, and after 2 weeks they're no longer called current. We never take them down, we just leave up the year. It's like a cumulative summary of what's been reported all year. And you can go online and select your lake or your county and filter it and generate a little report. You can print out a report of all the HAB reports from your lake for the year. So it doesn't look like this right now. Right now there's only a handful of reports for 2022. This is a picture from last year. And that's it for me. So this is me wearing my HABs hat. I'll be wearing my CSLAP hat a little later. We're going to have Vinny go and then take questions at the end. Sure. I don't know which one 10 was. Is this 10? There you go. I have this all printed out too.
So the purpose of my presentation today is seeing how much everything that everyone has talked about when it comes to HABs affects Putnam County. Where we come from, where we're going, how's it look, how bad are we hit with this? So, not everyone that's in Putnam County knows the whole county. So this is just a brief overview of what the lakes look like in Putnam County and the regulated beaches. So we have 32 public beaches spread over 18 different bodies of water across the state of county. 17 of those beaches are only 4 water bodies. 15 of those beaches are one valley, Putnam Valley. Now, in addition to that, the way the public health part works is the regulations can only affect a regulated covered beach, which is a beach that's for public swimming. So any private beach, any HOA beach or backyard beach, we don't have any purview on it. We don't have any regulations that cover them. We don't have anything that enacts us to go out there to force anything. But we always act as a resource. So, past 4 years, this is the total number of closures we've had at regulated beaches. So 18, we had 12 closures, lost 33 swim days. 19, 18 closures, 170 swim days lost. Most of these years it accounts for the majority of the season being closed. We actually have a beach manager here today. Their beach has lost 2 years, almost entirely, just from blue-green algae blooms coming in and out. 1 year they had 3 days, another year they had 7, another year they had none. It's rough. And anyone that's on some of the more rural lakes that we don't get out to, that we don't have a public beach on, unfortunately, I don't have that specific data. But luckily, I was able to steal stuff from DEC. So, this was completely stolen from the NYHABs spreadsheets that they have at the end. On your left is 2021, on your right is 2020. You see, many of these beaches, many of these lakes that are listed here, we don't have any public beaches on. So we have no information or any reason to go out on Portland Falls Reservoir, Kentwood Lake, Kirk Lake, Lake Tibbet. What's the other ones? If you know White Mountain. We don't have any regulated beaches out there, so we don't have eyes on it. But that doesn't mean that we don't care about it. We're the same resources that we can provide to any of our regulated beaches, all of our public beaches. We are also a source of information for anyone here. So far this year, I've gone out on 2 potential blue-green algae investigations to look at, one of which was a filamentous green and one of which was a horrible hollow bloom. So if anyone that's on these private beaches where you don't have to deal with us on a daily basis, and you want it, and you want information from us, feel free to contact us or go on to any of these resources. As Rebecca said, this has been a real big 3-party movement over the years. DEC, State DOH, and the local LHDs, local health departments. It's been teamwork, it's been taxing, to say the least. But one thing is that, as Rebecca's slide showed, with all the locations of where the blooms have been, if you noticed, you couldn't really make out where Putnam County was, because there were so many green dots. We've kind of led the state in many years in the instances of blue-green algae blooms across the county. If not on the top, we're within the top 5. Not something for bragging rights, but it does mean that we have a lot of experience with it. We have great partners in different state agencies, and hopefully for the lakes that are out here that we don't currently partner with, that we don't know you. We're here to help. Please feel free to reach out, give a phone call, send an email. If you guys need anything in the world, we're here to help you out, point you in the right direction. It's not something we can answer ourselves. So I'm going to Rebecca come back up and we'll field your questions. Thank you.
An answer that's not unique to Putnam County. It is applicable to the entire state. That so our permitting program that I mentioned is for algicides, pesticides. So those are substances that the EPA has said this can be used as an algicide. All of these nutrient activists don't meet that criteria. So it's a double-edged sword where we cannot say you can use this to get rid of your algae because it's not an algicide. Is that? So it's a tricky loophole, and we are working through a process of understanding how we can use it in times of year where there's less algae present, so that it is not being used as an algicide. Okay, it is strictly focusing on the phosphorus aspect, which AJ explained extremely well. It's a long process. It's involves, you know, scientists, our permit staff, lawyers. It is not stalled. It's moving. We are did 2 pilot demonstrations in this area, and as opposed to just, you know, doing it once and saying, okay, it works, everybody use it. No, we're actually taking the time to follow it up with several years of post-treatment sampling. So what happens 2 years later, 3 years later? Did the blooms stop? Were any non-target, like fish or other organisms impacted? So we are still in that process of studying the previous pilots and implementing this one new pilot in a larger lake coming online this year. And don't give up hope, okay? We have a lot of tools in the toolbox, and we are always looking to add to that toolbox.
My question is about the protocol of the Department of Health for reopening beaches after they close them. And this was something that a lot of people expressed frustration to me, because closing, that's pretty cut and dry. They observe, but then they also sample, and they see the results of the sample. For reopening, I guess the problem that came up is we often have very light, early morning blooms, even when we're not getting heavy algal blooms. The Department of Health would come first thing in the morning, if they see any evidence of any bloom. They said that the state DOA protocol was they were not to take a sample, and they were to see if they could reopen beaches. So we wouldn't even find out, you know, whether we had a have or not.
Okay, so let me start with asking, what county?
Westchester.
Okay, so the question was on the health department policies and procedures on reopening beaches. Now, I can only speak for the basic state policy and how we implement it in Putnam County. I cannot speak for how Westchester handles it. Being that it's a whole state, each county has the ability to be slightly different. So when we handle it is we close on a visual inspection. As it's been said all the time, if it's there, see it, avoid it, report it? No, report it. I know there's a bunch of this. And that's the first thing. If it's there, we close the beach. There's no testing at that point. We don't even test at that point. We close it purely on visual. Now we reopen on the test. The problem is that, as Rebecca's slide said, just because the bloom is no longer in the area does not mean the toxins are still there. So it has to be gone for 24 hours. That's usually been the rule that's allowed the bloom to be gone for long enough that the toxins are left. I am with you in saying why we're waiting so long, etc. I was a non-believer up until about 3.5 years ago. When we actually, there was a beach that was clear, crystal clear, bloom had been gone for 24 hours, almost 36 hours. By the time we took the sample. Took the sample, sent it up to the state, I'm all set to reopen them. The toxin level is 5 times the highest level that's allowed. Had to be closed. Water looked crystal clear. So there is that reason why we have to give it a moment, then test, and then reopen. And it's because, as Rebecca said, sometimes toxins aren't visible, and there's no indication of anything.
Yeah, I think the frustration by swimmers is that they come to the beach in the afternoon and see clear water and say, well, why isn't the health department even testing to see if it's real?
Kind of alongside of that, I mean, I think it's important to test because, you know, I think the biggest complaints around our beaches have been they know DEC comes to test and wondering if there would be a faster turnaround time on testing the water. A lot of times it happens like on a Thursday or Friday, that wipes out the weekend for somebody no matter what, and then like 3 or 4 days so the test can pass. So there was, I'll just go quick. They were saying, is there alternative ways? I think they said the test has to get sent to Albany or New Falls or something. Is there any other way that could be tested quicker or local water testing that could also provide that?
Let me just jump out and ask you 2 points of clarification.
Okay.
One, what county?
5 minutes.
Okay, because, and then the second thing is, Sure the DEC that's sample?
No.
Because I'll tell you right now, it's not the DEC that does the sample.
Well,
It's us.
whoever officially comes and closes the beach where they saw a bloom, they
That's me.
Yeah, so they don't test when they close it. They close it based on the visual observations.
And then,
Yeah.
but who takes the test?
The test is done, collected by many after the bloom is gone, then it gets analyzed, then it gets reopened. And there is a little bit of a delay, but it's all, as Vinny mentioned, in the interest of protection of health.
So it's not, I'm not sure the time frame that you were given. Normally, when we take the test, it goes up to the state lab in Albany, same day.
Okay.
It gets there that morning, no later than 10 a.m. We have to handle the results of the analysis by about 2 p.m., 1 p.m. that day, the day after the samples are collected, and I do a verbal and email to the beach management building. Now, the holes in the plan, as you're talking about, is when the reopening sample is collected on Friday. Yes, unfortunately, it's closed for the weekend. At this time, there's nothing that can be done. In the initial phases of this program, there were different options, there were different end runs that were able to be done, there were test strips, that were found to be unreliable, and there was other stuff. Unfortunately, at this moment, there's no other way to test.
I'm just asking because we're here, not every student asking, but we're here to go back to our residents of the beach and say, this is why. So you give me that answer.
Hi, I'm sorry, I just got a high sign from Maureen to cut off the questions now to keep us going. Can I actually move that way?
Okay, so again, thank you to everyone here, both Rebecca and Vinny for that. I really want to thank everybody again. We are trying to stay on time, and so the lunches have been delivered. They're on the back table. Please realize I think we are back here in 40 minutes, so that will be at 12:30. I was reminded to say for people who do not or haven't seen it yet that there, Sedgwood does have a internet, and if you want it, the password is
Boathouse.
Boathouse. Thank you.
The network name is Sedgwood, and the password is Boathouse, lowercase, one word.
Okay. So with that, again, I hope you enjoyed this morning. Have a good lunch. Talk with a lot of people. It's a chance to ask questions. See you back here at 12:30. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Charlie's on the Lake Mayapack Advisory.
Good afternoon, everyone. Charlie and I are here to discuss the effects of grass carp on Lake Mayapack today.
I also want to introduce Ed Barnett, who's been the chairman of the Lakes Park District he introduced me to the Lake Park District, also brought me in as a diver for the biomass studies as well. So if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't really be here today. Thank you.
Okay, so you know what? I'm going to go on this side, maybe. I need to go there. Oh, is there? Okay, let me go here. Sorry. All right, we'll do it this way. Okay. Anyway, so just so you know, it's a lot of data to go through for 25 years. And in fact, it's actually more than 25 years. The study began pre-CARP in 1993 and was done by a gentleman named Grimm, and he was with Northeast Biologist, which I had in the presentation. So I did use some of that data, of course, to show you how effective carp have been over the years. And I have actually, just so you know,
been doing this study since 1998. So I have a few years under my belt as well. So what I wanted to do is just give you an overview of Lake Mahopac. How many people know of Lake Mahopac? Oh, that's good. Okay, all right. So you're familiar with the fact that Lake Mahopac is a fairly large lake, 586 acres. It's about almost 4 miles around. Its deepest part is 20 meters, which is about, over 60 feet. And its average depth is about 8.5 meters. This is an important thing to remember when I talk about our results, and that is because it's a large lake and because it's so deep, okay, it does have a tendency to be able to buffer against changes relative to some of the smaller lakes and ponds in the area. The trophic status, as it is a mesotrophic. We do have a professor at Fordham who has also been IDing phytoplankton algae from the deep water site for approximately, probably just as long as I have been doing it as well. And although the change in the community hasn't been, pre-post-carp, hasn't been significant, there are some recently, when I say recently, like from 2008 to 2021, evidence to suggest that it's going from a blue-green dominant to actually green and diatom dominant, okay? But again, that's not what I'm going to report on in this talk, only because there's so much data to that, and that would be way over time. But just some information for you. Land use, since most of you know Lake Mahopac, it is one of the, I don't even know the stat, I don't know if it's the only lake in Putnam County that has motorized boats on it. No, okay. So, but because of that, okay, it is a highly recreational lake. We do have 2 marinas that sit on the shorelines of Lake Mahopac, and so weekends get very busy, and people enjoy the lake. And so again, the reason why I bring that up is because one of the reasons for wanting to manage the plants at the time was the concern of those that live on the lake and also use on the lake, that their swimming and boating would be impaired, and so that was one of the impetus, right? The people living around the lake. I don't know if most of you, but those that do live around the lake, home values are important to you, and the reason why you live around the lake is because you want to enjoy the lake for recreation. The land use around it, yes, residential, there's which I'll show you in a map, there's a small area, commercial area, downtown Mahopac, but most of the homes, or most of it is homes, and they all have septic systems, okay? So like the other speakers earlier, they honed in, or they were talking about the reasons why you would have a productive lake, the causes of that. What I'll be talking about is a management technique that actually, takes care of the symptom, but not necessarily the cause. Again, okay, so the major lake management issue was Eurasian milfoil, and the choice was to go with triploid grass carp. However, before that, they did use a weed harvester. Okay, so that gets us to why the carp. And so prior to the stocking of the grass carp, like I said, they used a harvester to remove the plants, but there were 3 major drawbacks to it. Ed, are you okay with that? Or? Oh, okay. I told Ed he can jump in at any time because this predates me, and he has a lot more historical knowledge than I do. So, but the 3 drawbacks: it was expensive, it was labor intensive, and although effective in the short term, it did not have a long term effectiveness. And so
still chopped up by boat motors and repopulating itself. What we also found that when the boats cut through it, it actually re-roots itself and attaches itself to other plants as well. So that was one of the problems that we see back then. So the weed hopper was just not a good solution at all.
And so, as you guess, the carp, although it's an expense in the front, front end expense, it's not nearly the expense that you pay for a harvester. Labor, you've got the guy or gal who's coming and driving the truck to you and doing the stocking. That's your labor cost, but having a harvester, it was labor intensive. You had to hire somebody to run that harvester. And yes, like Charlie mentioned, it did have some effectiveness, but it had some negatives to it. But you put the carp in, and carp have a tendency to live 8 to 12 years, at least that's what's expected. And so that would give you a longer term effectiveness, a management strategy. So how many grass carp? So I put this in there as a, just to show over time. So in 1994, that's when they put in a little over 2,500 carp, and they put it all in one shot. Okay, this was based on the DEC's recommendation of a rate based on vegetative acreage of Lake Mayapack. And do you recall about how widespread it was? I mean, I saw in Grimm's report it was, yes.
I mean, literally, the lake looked like a map all the way out to where the depth just stops at. When the depth goes past 18 foot, it looked like a green map. You couldn't see any water. It literally was like a full surface. And then the weed hopper was cutting it, but it really wasn't helping a whole lot because it grew up really quickly. The best way we got out, some people got out, was yanking out from the roots and clearing areas that way, but that's labor intensive. As a scuba diver, that's what I did part of the neighborhood as well. But it looked terrible. It actually looked like I could walk on the lake at that point in time. It was horrific.
So that's what I see.
Yeah. Yes. I do want to take a moment though. I have to give props to Charlie because he's our diver, and all these years, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have the data that I was able to present today. And it is not the cleanest of jobs when you're working over there in Lake Mayapack in the deeps of, anyway. So these here, the spring, fall, these here, that's just a signal to you. That's when the stocking occurred, okay? Because when I go ahead and show you data, I'll explain that, say for instance, in the fall of 2015, my data don't represent that stocking, right? Because I do my stocking in August. I do my sampling in August, okay? Now, one thing I want to point out is that what we decided to do is we decided to take a phased restocking approach, not putting all the carp in at one shot, but instead putting them in over time, every 2 years. Every 2 years. And just because we were thinking that if we did that, perhaps we would be able to, I use this term loosely, catch the optimum number of carp that would allow us for, to get rid of most of the Eurasian milfoil, but have some of the native plants, Nias, Valseneria, that's water celery, to come back so that we have a healthy population of plants in the lake and not get rid of all of them, right? The other thing is, what I want to say, well, I'll move on and then I'll say it so it's easier. Okay. So this is just giving you a sense of what we've done, okay, over the years. Again, I mentioned John Grimm. He had, the study 93 to 97, and I pretty much took over 98 to present. I was very happy that the board agreed to continue with the sampling,
even though the DEC did not require it. And the reason being, because not only is this a case study of how effective the CARP are, but it's also, I believe, evidence to say that long-term monitoring is very helpful when informing management. Okay?
Also, filamentous algae that came along afterwards was something that we should have kept, we need to keep track of as well, because that gets pretty bad at the bottom of the lake. Because the filamentous algae grows a huge amount on the bottom of the lake, and it adds to the silt level as well. And that's one of the things that I found as a diver, because people don't see that on the surface, but down the bottom you see that.
And you'll see that in a graph in a few more slides. As far as vegetation surveys, again, we did plant identification and biomass from 95, which was the initial post-CARP sampling, to present. But we added percent coverage only in 2017. And that was actually at the request of the DEC, which made a whole lot of sense, because a percent coverage will give you a better idea of what's happening around the lake as a whole, okay? Water quality, temperature and oxygen, water clarity, septic disc readings, for those of you that are doing CSLAP, familiar with that. Conductivity pH, chlorophyll A, which is a measurement of algal biomass, and nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in the form of nitrates and soluble and total phosphorus. Now, what I need to make clear as well is that these water quality variables were done at a deep water site. We have not studied the shoreline, the littoral area of Lake Mayapack, so when I report on these, that's where they're coming from, and I'll show you where that site is. Okay, so let's go through some sampling protocol really quickly. Here is Lake Mayapack. So how we do this is every year we go to the same 5 sites depicted by these X's here, okay? And we sample from 3 different areas. We just tag them as shallow, mid, and deep based on an estimated depth, right? So keep in mind, these are always the same area that we sample in, but we really base our sampling site on where we can find these depths, right? So that means that they're not exact locations. You know, we didn't take a GPS out there and sample from the same location. However, that doesn't mean so much in that as long as we can get to the deep water sites, mid-site and shallow. Now, this site here, so I know you're fairly familiar with Lake Mayapack, but just to have an understanding, most of this is all residential, and it's right down here, 6N, if you're familiar with 6N, that cuts through Mayapack. This is that area here, commercial area. These southern sites here specifically, they do get a lot of runoff, and they sit low to the road, so they're influenced more. I don't know if Kevin is still here, but I'd be curious to know what he was talking about with Lake Mayapack. I think it might be this site.
He put filters in where the shopping center is, like over in this area.
Makes sense.
By the storm drains.
Okay.
That's where they went.
So I bring all that up because these have really are influenced by, well, it's all influenced by land use, right? But both these sites we have found over time have been most affected in terms of plant growth, and and also with filamentous algae growth here at these 2 sites.
Those 2 coasts are the worst with the filamentous algae. When the weather gets warm, it grows up high. When I'm down on my knees at the bottom collecting samples, sometimes it's over my head because of the gas is pushing up. I came out and the swamp thing a couple of times.
We don't have a picture of that. Anyway, and so the samples were taken out of a known area using quadrats, and we did a wet weight, which simply meant that I squeezed as much water out as I could and then sampled them, measured them, excuse me. Okay.
Now, this slide is just to give you an indication as to where and what they look like as the site. So these southern coves here, and these red circles, right? So you could imagine that this would be, would go shallow, mid, and deep, okay? Also, I have to add, I have a lot to add. Ed was our jet ski sampler for many years, so a lot of that was done, just jet ski, grabbing samples, and then these other two sites, right? These other sites, the mid and the deep, Charlie took care of. Okay, some more. So this site here, what we call the east shoreline site, is this one here. And then the one to the right on the slide is going to be this one up here. This one is actually across from, this is Mayapack Golf Course. And this one up here is actually a beach area, Mayapack Woods. Again, keep in mind too that this is of course more forested, more trees, but these all have steep slopes like across the road, right? So when we get big storms, all that water's running in here. So all the sediment, nutrients, it's coming right in. Okay. All right. So dominant plant species in Mayapack. Well, Myriophyllum was certainly the dominant when the first stocking occurred in Mayapack in '94. And that pretty much, based on what Grim said, was about 95% of whatever he sampled, okay? Nias, this is a recent, not recent in that it's in the lake recently, it's probably always been in the lake, but when we did the phased restocking, what we found was, and you'll see that in a graph later, that Nias really was the first and dominant plant to come back, and Nias is a native. Lingbia, that was dominant when the plants no longer were existing in our sampling sites. Again, remember, 5 sampling sites. However, you could probably pretty much talk to anybody who lived on Lake Mayapack, and when the cart came in, they were all thrilled because they didn't see any plants, okay? Now, other plant species that are there, and that what I've noticed recently, for instance, in water celery, Balsaneria americana, is that this has come back at that like northern site that was at Mayapack, and it's come back in quite a good amounts. It is a native. Yes. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. See, I'm a talker. Okay, all right, ready? We'll go back to this. Ready? So sorry. So we're gonna get to here. This is really what I really want to see. Okay. So the effect of carp on aquatic plant biomass. Okay, just a takeaway, right? The big takeaway, of course, is what can you determine? Well, the carp are very effective at getting rid of plants. These are submerged plants. Notice again the takeaway. This from here to here was a sharp decrease. So about 3 years you didn't have any. And then from here, this is where we first stocked the plants. And then you'll see this gradual decrease in biomass. But again, that's that phased restocking. All right. This graph is just to show you that what happened when the submerged plants were not collected. And that, look at this, this is filamentous algae. Now keep in mind that there are 2 sites, the site, the southern and the southeastern cove, where a majority of this filamentous algae was found. All right, but notice, now I will say, I don't know, and I can't claim this, but I don't know if carp eat filamentous algae. But what we did notice is that there was a decrease in filamentous algae. The other point I want to make is that 2006 would have been about 12 years, the lifeline of the life expectancy of the carp, but yet we still had about 6 more years of no plants. So then the plants started to come back, and the benefit of doing the long-term sampling is that you could catch it here, because it does take time to get permits for carp, And so to continue to do the studying, it did see it was much higher here than it was here. I have my thoughts, but I'll quickly move through. But notice the gradual decrease here. We are seeing a little uptick of Lingvia, and so I would venture to guess that we're going to see the same pattern when we don't have enough plants to shade out the light or compete for the nutrients. Yeah. This graph here is just a look at the submerged aquatic plant community. Again, dominant is Nias and Myriophyllum. And notice pre-carp, or this would be the second, the restocking, phase restocking, how much Nias is here. Okay, so that seemed to have come back before the milfoil. But as we began to stock, notice the decrease in Nias, the increase in Myriophyllum, the Eurasian milfoil. Now, some could argue, which would be a good argument as well, that milfoil grows much higher than Nias. And so they're quicker growers, they can outcompete the light, the nutrients, and so maybe that's what's squelching, the Nias here. This is just, we'll go through this quick, this is visual inspection around the perimeter of the lake, 16 known sites that I did. This is just to show that after that, from 2017, the 77% represents how much of the lake was covered in aquatic plant material, which equated to about 203 acres. Our total acreage was 262 acres that we studied and sampled for percent coverage. 2021, we're at about 35% total coverage, which equates to about 90 acres. Okay, I'm so sorry I'm going through this so quickly. I'll take any questions after. So the sampling here, I put this in here just to show that here, the averages, this here to here, this is really pretty much, as you can see again, pre-carp, post-carp, that they're similar, right? That there's no real change in second depth, except when you get here. In which case, note, Lake Mahopac has zebra mussels, and they were first observed in 2015. Yeah, I know, it's a collective, oh, I know, yeah. So anyway, but notice what we found, and that is water clarity increased pretty significant, okay? Again, this is from the deep water site. Now, Grimm, when he first studied, he made the claim that he thought that water clarity would improve with the stocking of carp. I took over. Now, again, we're different people, right? So there could be that bias too. But notice through time, it really didn't make a difference. This is just to say that Lake Mahopac as well, for oxygen levels, were not really affected, at least in the deep water area. Again, that's something that needs to be noted. We didn't do them in the coves themselves. But that the oxygen and temperature profiles, okay, remained relatively the same. Mahopac has historically had a deep, lower anoxic, very little to no oxygen after 10 meters, so that's fairly deep. And then up at the upper waters, usually around 8 milligrams per liter here, so no real change. All right, so what we've learned? Well, we learned that grass carp are very effective in Lake Mahopac. That they consumed all the aquatic plants after the initial stocking in 1994, in about 3 years. There's possible evidence that Nias glycils is a preference, but that's to be explored some more. And that benthic filamentous algae became dominant at all those sites when they didn't have to compete with the plants. And again, water clarity and oxygen levels were similar. And again, right here, chlorophyll and community composition of algae were also similar. Okay, thank you. If anybody has any questions.
Yes.
Any idea what that cost?
Do you know, is that
Would
something that?
you know that? But the current cost
I mean, recently or is it just
in the past, that's
Recently, probably.
about right now.
that I don't know, it's roughly around about $7.
Yeah, and you know what, I can get that for you, because I have to look, I think I have a quote. Yeah. I'm sorry. No, no, that more than likely came from boats that came in, yeah. I'm gonna take some of it back. Oh,
I think Alyssa, you guys are gonna stick around.
I am,
right?
yeah.
So if you can address your questions maybe after.
That's
Just
fine.
have one more thing to say. On lakemaypath.org, we have the lake studies out there. We have some random ones from 85, 90s, and from 98, I think, on up. We have all of them out there. And you can see those as well. And we also have some fish studies to explain what happened to certain species over time. So, perch pretty much disappeared when the weeds went. The website is that's lakemaypath.org.
Okay, I'm here to introduce Ann Campbell, who's going to speak about Kent's success in winning grants specifically for lakes. Ann is a newly elected Kent Town board member. She's been on the board for 5 months. She is liaison with the Kent Conservation Advisory Committee, and she's a co-founder of our Kent Climate Smart Task Force. And in her day job, she's a college professor at SUNY New Paltz in communications disorders. And Cameron.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. It's been a great opportunity for me to learn. As Kathy said, my day job is as a professor, but in this role on the town board, I have been a student in many ways. One of the things that I've been deeply involved in the last 5 months is serving as the liaison between the town's grant writing firm that they first contracted with over a year ago and the various constituents in the town that are seeking funding. So I'm going to present from a little bit of a different perspective. I've also been learning a lot about the history of what our town has done with respect to lakes. And I put this up, why Kent Lakes, because there's a lot of confusion in Kent. One of our major communities is Lake Carmel. We share a zip code with Carmel. And so we have an identity crisis. And at one point, somebody negotiated with the post office to give Kent its own name, that they would still deliver mail under that name. And the name Kent Lakes was chosen. And I think that's obvious why when you look at the map. Although I just found out that Putnam Valley may have more lakes than Kent. So, but I have heard that about half of the town is either owned by DEC or DEP or under easement. We have about 13 lakes, so about 6% of our surface area is water. And what was even more mind-boggling to me, and this is probably true for a lot of the communities around here, is to see that much of Kent is watershed. There's a little corner that might not be, but we just found out that that's part of the Fishkill Creek watershed. So a lot of the concerns that you all have with your lakes, Kent has in spades as well. So what do I want to cover today? I've been learning about the history of what our town has been doing with respect to lakes. This goes back to, I believe, the 90s. We already have a Lakes Committee. We've had an active Stormwater Committee. We currently have the Kent Lakes Association. And this is the work of a huge number of dedicated volunteers who have a lot of expertise. So I want to review that, talk about sources of funding for lake projects. I'll talk a little bit about what's involved in applying for and managing grants, whether or not you have the benefit of a grant writing firm, and some suggestions for how different lake associations can take action. So here's a bit of the history that I've been learning about. The current Lakes Committee, which is a consortium of representatives from the different lake associations, was formed around 2017. And again, dedicated, knowledgeable volunteers are doing this work with support from our environmental consultant, Bruce Barber. So some of the programs that they've been involved with, a program called Adopt a Pipe that Bruce could tell you more about, but it involves sampling for phosphorus in the early stages of one of these heavy rainstorm events to try to pinpoint where the phosphorus is coming from and how much. The CSLAP program that a lot of you are here to be trained for today, and programs such as Trees for Tribs and Buffer in a Bag that have allowed the community to put beneficial trees and shrubs in those buffer zones in the watershed. There was some research that was done here in the town on harmful algal blooms, and I don't know the details on this. It was back in 2019. Some various treatment methods were tested. The town also received a grant from NUIPIC, which is that New England consortium. I'll say a little bit more about that. But very much like the study that Ms. Schnabel was talking about earlier today, working on sources of contamination in Palmer Lake, which is an impaired lake. PRISM has been very active in the town. Notably, I believe it was in 2019 that PRISM came in and removed 22,000 water chestnut plants from the lake at the Putnam County Park. And I think that work is ongoing because it takes multiple years to eradicate them completely. The town also had a grant with PRISM on aquatic invasives that was completed last year. You've heard from East of Hudson, and I was very impressed to see that East of Hudson has 16 projects on their website. It's recent projects in Kent, retention ponds and things of that nature. This past year, the town was awarded a grant by DEC to do engineering on the Lake Carmel Dam, which has been known to be at risk for about 40 years. And so the first step, obviously, is to get the engineering work done, and we're also seeking funding to get the dam itself repaired. And the town also was awarded a couple of grants to do engineering for stream bank stabilization as a way of controlling phosphorus getting into a couple of the lakes. So I'll say a bit more about those later on. So here are some of the funding sources that you might want to consider. And I tried to sort of make this hierarchical, starting with state assembly and congressional appropriations. So right now, Kent has applied through Congressman Maloney's office for an appropriation to repair the Lake Carmel Dam. Working our way down, NUIPIC has been around for 75 years. That's an interstate organization with New England and New York. And I believe, again, that they actually approached the town to conduct that study that was done in Lake Carmel and Palmer Lake. DEC does have a lot of grant programs. So, for example, through Hudson River Estuary Program, water quality improvement grants, non-agricultural non-point source pollution, and the Climate Smart Program. And again, you've already heard about East of Hudson, really active in this area. What you might not know, it's a bit of a well-kept secret, is that starting last year, for those of you in Putnam, the county has soil and water conservation district funds, and some of that funding was actually allocated to towns last year. So there will be sort of a small grant opportunity for towns to apply, and you might want to check with your town supervisor about that. I put links here for PRISMs and for Trees for Tribs. Watershed Agricultural Council, I believe we have a representative from both of these groups here today. And again, the Buffer in a Bag program as well. And my understanding, and again, this is all very new for me, is that not only are these trees and shrubs provided, but they will actually come in and plant them in the various locations. So who can get grant funding? Most of the grants that are out there need to go either to a municipality or some other kind of nonprofit entity. Although my understanding is that for some of these programs, like Trees for Tribs and Buffer and Bag, private homeowners can apply. So what do you do if you're in a private lake association or some other organization that's not nonprofit? In the case of the Kent Conservation Advisory Committee, we actually created the Kent Conservation Foundation. because we have a stewardship agreement for the minimum fire tower, but the town could not receive grants to maintain or repair the fire tower since it is on state property, it's not town property. We recently were approached by a new alliance for the Fishkill Creek Watershed. They're working on a grant to do some educational programming, and so they've teamed up with a university, Pace University Law Center, for their program. And then lake associations can work in partnership with the town. The only hitch is that if there's a matching component required in the grant, the town cannot pay that match to the private association. But some of the challenges involved in applying for grants, and I saw this with the KCAC, is often by the time you know the opportunity is available, it's almost too late to get organized to apply, especially if you're relying on busy volunteers to do the application. It takes resources and expertise to be successful. So if you have the opportunity in your community to have a grant writing firm, that can be beneficial. And I have to say for Kent, even in the first year, the amount of funding that was brought to the town, many different aspects of funding, far outweighed the cost of retaining the grant writing firm. So for example, $1 million grant to repair the bridge and culvert at Lake Louise, almost $500,000 for a park, things like that, grants for police, fire department, and so forth, in addition to environmentally and liquidity grants. So how does one work with the firm? What do they provide? Generally, the goal of these firms is to be experts in the different opportunities. They do research. They know what's coming up, when they can expect those funding streams to be available. And they sit down with the members of the municipality and find out the priorities in all different areas. So they try to make good matches between what's available and what the town is seeking. They will put the application together, but of course they can't do that in a vacuum. So the members of the town have to provide the information to produce the application. And that can be time consuming, even though they do the actual writing, developing the narrative, and so forth. You might be having to go out and seek quotes so that a budget can be prepared. You might be providing information about personnel and so forth. The other thing that caught me by surprise the first time I did this is that these grants normally would also require letters of support. And so suddenly we had an application going in and we needed to scurry around and go everywhere from Assemblywoman Galiff's office to the county to various organizations in town to obtain these letters. And normally the grant writing firm will give you a template for the letter, but then you have to customize it for the different individuals or organizations that are providing support and ask them to please sign off and send those back. And then the grant firm is responsible for uploading the submission and the letters of support. And normally these go into various kinds of online portals. So bottom line, very high return on investment if your municipality opts to do this. They can address a variety of different kinds of priorities. And again, water quality, lakes, and the environment can be high on that priority list. Meanwhile, what happens at the town end? What's our responsibility? Well, one of the things we recognized is that communication and teamwork are vital. So before we launch into applying for a grant at this point, we now discuss it in the town board and actually vote on whether or not we should apply. So we talk about the benefits of the program, the logistics involved, and the fiscal implications, because most grants require some kind of a match. And if that match has to be provided through funds, that has an implication for the town budget. So sometimes there's a program which is already in the budget, and then we can seek funding to cover part of the cost. Right now, for example, we're interested in pursuing a transportation alternatives grant for safer walking and cycling in the town. Sidewalks, sharrows, that kind of thing. To apply for that grant, we need to have an engineering study done to develop a plan. You can't apply for the grant without a plan for what we want to do. So the town board has already voted to fund the costs of that engineering report. I just learned of an opportunity that might pay through Climate Smart for half of that. So that makes sense. If we've already voted to spend the money, getting half of it back is a good thing. On the other hand, if it's something for which we haven't budgeted, then it's problematic. Sometimes that can be met through in-kind labor and also through volunteers. And there are certain rates at which you can charge volunteer time depending on whether it's sort of generic volunteer work or whether it's somebody with specialized expertise. So after we have that vote on whether or not to pursue the grant, we also have to have very clear communication, this is something we learned the hard way, about the roles and responsibilities of everybody involved. And that includes town employees, it includes consultants who might be hired or involved, and what we call subcontractors, because basically when you get a grant, the municipality is the contractor. And then if you are having others do the work, they are your subcontractors. So we vote to approve the submission, we make sure that everything's aligned with respect to roles and communication. We have to provide the information to the grant writing firm so they can put the application together. And again, we have to chase around for these letters of support before the application goes in. And if we're lucky enough to be awarded the funding, then we have to vote on what's called a resolution of acceptance to receive the grant and receive the funds. And then we have to manage it. So getting the funding is just the beginning, literally the tip of the iceberg. The grant funding agencies don't just hand out checks, right? They negotiate contracts with the recipient. So we are then the contractor. So if you're lucky enough to receive the grant, you have to review the award letter, see what's required there, and of course celebrate the success. Then there are documents that have to be submitted before the contract will be issued. And one thing I've also learned is that these processes can take time. It was very anxiety-provoking for me in the beginning to realize that we had put a timeline into a grant application that was about to expire, and the contract had not yet been issued in the portal, that we could even sign it, let alone start the work. But sometimes these timelines get altered, and the sponsors are flexible about that. But here are some of the kinds of things that might have to be submitted. Proof of insurance or non-discrimination policies, minority and women on business forms, detailed work plans. If land is involved, you might have to show a survey or a deed. If the work plan and budget were not terribly detailed in the grant application, you're going to look for a much more detailed documents to be submitted. That can take time. So all of this requires management. Once all of that goes in, is acceptable to the sponsor, then a contract is issued, and then it has to be signed by the representative of the town, in our case, the supervisor. And then that's just the beginning, because then the work has to go forward, and progress reports need to be submitted. The sponsor is not going to continue to provide the funding and pay the bills unless the work is being done and documented. So we need to track what's being done. Volunteer and in-kind labor hours, and the budget, how things are being spent. We also have to guide the project and oversee the work of any subcontractors that we might have involved. So the budget for the grant can include what you would call overhead. You can budget in some funds to actually pay people to do this kind of administrative work. Here's an example from a grant that we obtained to do a natural resources inventory for Kent. And again, I was a little bit naive once we supplied the information, and I was involved with this as part of the KCAC. Very excited, we got the grant, now what? And suddenly I realized that the sponsor expected us to have a large team that would be involved actively in the work and overseeing what was going on. We were a bit unprepared for this, but we quickly put together our steering committee. So the match for this grant is actually being covered by volunteer in-kind labor from two amazing biologists. One, a current member of our KCAC, Bill Buck, and another, our former member and chair, Beth Hurd. And so along with the standard kind of NRI, they're doing a detailed deep dive into species in Kent. And their labor is then providing the 15% match that the grant required. So here are the members of our steering committee. It's about a dozen people, including a representative from the sponsor, DEC, two members from Hudsonia, which is the organization that we contracted with to develop the conventional part of the NRI. But then to make sure that this project is going to be useful, that the report will be used, and also to ensure that the staff at Hudsonia have all the information they need. We have people from the Historical Society, the town historian, we have people from the planning board, right? It's a big effort. And again, this is something that caught us by surprise. As I said, Grants 101, we're learning. So now we're meeting monthly to ensure that the project will be guided appropriately and will be maximally useful, and also to ensure that members of the community understand what it is and how to use it. So that's an example of what's involved in grant management. The other thing I've been learning about is this idea of bootstrapping. So to solve big problems, we need big money, but we don't always have that available. So very often the first step is a smaller engineering study funded by a smaller grant. So I mentioned the high hazard dam work for Lake Carmel. That's one example. Another is the stream bank stabilization studies that we were just funded for. Those are just the engineering studies. Then we're going to have to apply for additional funding to get the work done. And an important point here is that the kinds of water quality data that you're all talking about obtaining, I'm very impressed by some of what I've seen here today on how people are doing it. That's essential in documenting the problems and getting a baseline. If you can't show that your lake is impaired, you're going to be less successful in getting funding to address it. So I can't stress that enough, and again, I'm really impressed by the kinds of efforts that I see going on. So how do you choose the projects you want to see? I've listed a few topics here, and I'm sure the experts here could name more different kinds of things that you might want to address. But again, this has to be data-driven decisions. Once you understand the nature of the problems at your lake, is it something that can be pinpointed, like septic issues? Is it something more dispersed, like phosphorus that's embedded in the stream banks and so forth? Once you know what the problems are, then you need to have the kind of dialogue that a lot of you are having here at this meeting and in other venues. Lake association members, talking with other associations, if you have a lake manager or an environmental consultant. And again, the town needs to be involved. I know in Kent, supervisors, former supervisors have been hugely instrumental in supporting these efforts. And obviously, if you have a grant firm available, you need to have that conversation as well. And the dialogue with the sponsors themselves. And even if you don't have a grant writing firm, it is possible to become well informed about grant opportunities and to provide that information back to your town. For example, a member of this community may be aware that one of the DEC grants that's now available would also cover the construction of a salt dome, a structure to keep salt, road salt, that's being stored from leaching into the environment. And this is something we have not talked about with our grant writing firm, but when I mentioned it to our highway superintendent, he was interested. So it's important for community members to become as informed as possible and to have that dialogue with those who are involved with grant writing, if you do have a firm. So what can lake associations do? Again, looking in from the outside as a new town board member, it seems that these collaborations are tremendously important. I think that having the different representatives of the lakes in Kent all working together and meeting together has been a powerful factor here. Sharing their expertise, sharing information and resources, and working collectively. Some of the problems are similar across certain lakes, some are different, but the networking seems to be valuable. Again, if you're not a nonprofit, familiar with that, but you get into the stream and you trudge around and you scoop everything up with a net and look for aquatic invertebrates, and it's a way of assessing the health of the stream. That's a DEC program. Obviously, I've seen tremendous work on Lake Nampac here just now. Documenting those kinds of things is, again, a powerful way to be able to justify funding when you get to applying for it. So this is what I've learned in my 5 months. I hope these ideas are beneficial to you. And I don't know if we have time for questions. I think we were a bit off schedule and I forgot to start my clock, so I have no idea where we'll begin. Do we have time for questions? 2 minutes. But otherwise, okay. Right here first.
We've kind of gone through this whole process. We live on Gateway Lake in Poland. And I took out a major bridge and cut over the path. So now we have been living in a very rough situation where services can't get in, mosquitoes, because there's no turnaround. It's a small little road that was meant to drive through out the other side. And now it's dead end from both sides where you can't turn around. So we have this, trucks backing in, go backing out the whole way. So we went through FEMA, we went through everything. And we just went through a grant process with the town. And Rick over here, his wife, Marilyn, did almost like a grant writer. I mean, it was amazing. All the letters, everything you talked about. And, like, what do you do? Like, they just said they just didn't have and they said no. They didn't want to go help us with it. So what do you do when you're in a situation like, because we're a homeowner association? I'm told by our attorney we're a non-profit, but we're not a charitable. So something where I may be talking to you aside and try to figure out other options.
Well, I'm in a different county and different town.
Well, I know, just for ideas, directions.
I'd be happy to talk to you, but I'm not sure I have the expertise to assist you there. It sounds like you're way ahead of anything I could suggest. So maybe there are others here who could provide some good suggestions. I'm sorry. Well, if you go to Congressman Maloney's website, he has a questionnaire you can click to fill in what your infrastructure priorities are. So my understanding is some of that infrastructure is coming through congressional appropriation, but that municipalities can apply for that. What's that? Thank you. So yes, some of it goes into state police.
She's a graduate of Brown University with a degree in mathematics. So she is one smart cookie. And her master's degree is from MIT Sloan School of Management. For 34 years, she worked for IBM in a whole variety of capacities, mostly in finance and ending as a vice president of finance. Even before she retired, she was already on the board of her Lake Association, the Three Lakes Council, and on the Conservation Advisory Council of her town. When she retired, she didn't just continue those things. She became the chair of her town's CAC, and she became the vice president of Three Lakes Council. And then in 2008, 2 years after her retirement, she joined the board of the New York State Association of Lake Associations, NICEFOLA. And 2 years after that, took on the responsibility of NICEFOLA's secretary, which is a big job. And she's held that ever since, 12 years. In 2012, she became the president of the Three Lakes Council. She's held that job now for 10 years. And in 2018, she moved from being the chair of the Lewisburg CAC to being the chair of their planning board. So she's not three people, but she sure feels like it to me. It's amazing. I'm going to end this too long introduction, which Jen will probably never forgive me for, with a quote from the president of NICEFOLA. Jen is invaluable to the running of NICEFOLA. Her knowledge of the CSLAP program and her ability to run precise analytic analyses have been critical in keeping this program running for decades. Her dedication to the organization and the countless hours she has committed to its success cannot be overstated. So I'm very
thank you, Ina, and you're right, forgiveness will take a long time. Okay, and the whole thing is that I've never really learned that two-letter word, no. I'm working on it, but I'm not very good at it. All right, so a couple of announcements, I think. One is we still have the phone that was left in the ADA bathroom here. If you are missing a phone, let me know. I hate the idea of somebody going home without it unless I need to try to figure out how to track somebody down. I do not yet know how to unlock a phone, but I'm willing to try. Okay. Second is I want to see, how many people here, this is aimed a little bit at CSLAP volunteers. So I want to know how many people are CSLAP volunteers? Okay, good crowd. All right, so there's the other thing, let me run through these slides, and I'm going to, because we only have 15 minutes for this. Rebecca has also offered to try to show some of the other tools like DEC locator and some other things that are not necessarily CSLAP. So I'm going to run through my slides and then we can decide what your live presentation will be part of. Okay, so with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the HABs notification tool. Rebecca talked about it before. It's really important because it's the foundation of these more recent tools that have come out. And the CSLAP dashboard is that most recent tool I'm going to talk about. That's where you can get CSLAP reports. And I would say CSLAP reports, I go out and look at neighboring lakes and see what they are encountering. I want to see if the changes in my lake are maybe reflected in what's happening in other places in the town, or if they're not, if it's climate, so there's a lot of that. It's where this year's volunteers will do CSLAP data entry, and where you can do HABs data entry as well. So I'm going to talk about that. There is a new email address basically for all things CSLAP, CSLAP info. I suspect that ends up at Rebecca's desk, like some of us that have many of these. And there was a webinar on how to use the CSLAP dashboard, and the replay is available on the website under the CSLAP tab under protocols and forms. But with that, HAB notifications. So you guys should know about this. If there's been a HAB on your lake or a lake you're thinking about visiting, it's really important. Now, I have problems remembering how to get to some websites so you can bookmark it, but then I forget where my bookmark is. So when I remember this, you think about, you have a HAB, oh no. So I always think of this says, oh no, New York, .gov, you know, NY-HABs. And that's important, so I want you all to kind of say with me, it has nothing to do with a political view of New York, it's HABs, but say, oh no, New York, .gov. Okay, so that's how you get there. And so this one you can see, well you probably can't because it's in small print, but this is a HAB for New York, for New York City, and it tells you some information about the HABs. And so you guys, if you go to a lake and you kind of want to know if something's been said, this is a place to find out if anything's happened that year. Okay. So we now have a new CSLAP dashboard. It's where you can enter what I used to call a CSLAP session. It's now being called rounds. So it's the round data. You can get your CSLAP reports. You can do in-season comparisons for the current year. And very importantly, the 2021 reports, when they come out, are going to have all of your lake data in it from all the past year's sampling. So if you have a lake manager, if you have somebody who wants to know, this is a really important source of data. Okay, lake number. This is Rebecca's mission in life to have everyone know what your lake number is. Okay? So every lake has a unique number. It's assigned sequentially based on the start date. Lake Wacabuc was one of those back in 1986 when the program started. So it's lake number 4. Lake Escalita, I happen to know, is 205. That's my other lake. And my third lake is Lake Ripawam. That's 204. So I've got them all. There may be some sites that they have multiple sites on the lake. This is mostly some of the larger lakes and like the Finger Lakes. I don't think it happens here, but there might be a decimal. Very important, it's used to identify the sample bottles. So at some point when you fill out the form, you're going to be asked to talk about the sample bottle ID, and it's going to be year, lake number, and round number. And the round number, if you have a shallow lake, it's 01 through 08. If it's a deep sample, it's 11 through 18, 11, 12, 13, 14 for the very things. So you have to use the bottles in order. Very important this year, they're bar-coded. All right, so here's what you see when you go to, say it with me, oh no, .New York, .gov / and it's CSLAP _dashboard. Okay? So I'm just going to show you a couple things here. I think our battery went out. Oh, I've been going through. Okay. I got it here. So you can turn layers on and off with this, which is here, and I'm going to just show you that in a second. And then this gives you a little more map space, so you just can minimize that by doing that. So let me go to the next one here. So here, what I did was turn on CSLAP reports, and they go and they show you all these little sucky things. So here's Bear Pond, just over the hill there, and it has the 2019 and 2020 report. When the 2021 report is out here, you can click on that and get that and download. And you can see here, I minimize the slide over here to get a bigger picture. So that, if I wanted to bring that information back out, I click that again. Okay, so I'm going back. Oh, I meant to tell you something else about this. Up on here, how to use the dashboard. There's some information up there as well. So, how do you become a CSLAP member? How do you get put into the system?
This is the portal for CSLAP.
Yeah, there's 4 CSLAP. Now, the HABs, any HAB report will show up on that HAB system, which is related. But this only has CSLAP data in it. say report ahead here if you're on CSLAP and you report ahead. Now, so let me go quickly through this. So you've seen this photo before. This is my photo. This is Lake Watershed 2012. I think it's actually been on the cover of an algae magazine. This is like nothing to be proud of, but you know, it's my only claim to fame. Okay. They want two pictures. One is sort of a lake view to give a scope of the bloom, and then a kind of a. I'm sorry? Yeah, that's the phone that somebody's calling it. Okay, so. Okay, ad-lib. All right, so
this phone has
so
actually been lost.
you want to take two pictures of the hat.
Who are you trying to call?
One is a general lake view, and the other is a close one of the bloom itself. Now, one of the problems is that if you try to take a picture, you might get a reflection of yourself or the sky. So try to be sort of, careful when you do it, because as you heard before, it's the visual appearance that makes this difference. So you use the report ahead button on the CSLAP _ dashboard. The user group is CSLAP, you select your lake number. And then you can move the cursor to show where the lake is. So, if you are not a CSLAP member, it's ohno.newyork.gov/tab form. Okay? And that is, so you can report one that way. It doesn't have quite the details that some of the things, it won't ask you for a CSLAP lake number, for example, so it's a little bit separate. Take photos required. Okay. Did I get it all of this? Okay. So here we are, back to where you come when you first come in. So these yellow dots are participating, orange dots are participating lakes. You want to say enter field data up there. Okay, over there. And it's pretty much what you would expect, pretty much what has been entered always before. You want the name of the person, an address, and then lake and lake number. So you can start typing for, yep.
I actually updated it so some of those will disappear. You don't have to search anything. So just updated it today.
Okay, I'm up to date. All right. So, yeah, the idea is to have this as easy as possible. The other thing I will say though here, you see this little icon there, the sort of a sideways arrow. You have to click on that to expand it. And if you do, we'll get the very next thing. So you can see it's been expanded, you can see all the questions. And it's all the things that we learned to take on our lake when we were CSAP sampling. Okay, I just want to say, here's the two places that, when I was kind of testing this, I had problems. The first one is here. If you, sample name and round number. So remember when I said before, you've got to have its year, lake number, and then the round number? If you start typing, because you put in your lake, 22, it will then come up with your lake number, and you can choose which round. But I had problems because I had no idea what this meant. I was like, sample name, surface. It didn't work. So 22, now it says it right there because Rebecca is great at getting feedback and updating the system for it. So that's there. And I didn't expand all these others. You see a bloom. The other thing is that comments are really useful, but I tend to write like a book. I think there's 255 characters and then it stops. So you can't say, saw a weird fish, there were swans on the thing, actually, you have to be, comments are really useful, but try to figure out what things might make more sense to the people reviewing this data. The other thing, so not no CSLAP person would ever do this, I know, but I have a boat sticker form, so people can sign up for boat stickers on it. And somebody was having the worst trouble, and I kept on testing it. If you don't hit submit, it won't go anywhere. So hit submit. Okay, so that was going to be the end of my presentation, and we would go for more, but I am out of time. All right, just quick questions.
Does this form take the place of a form that you fill out?
Great question. The question was, does this form take the place of the paper form we used to fill out? The answer is no. Fill out the paper form, and you can send that in just as you used to. Because let's say it asks you, for example, where was your surface sample taken? And if instead of putting in 1.5 meters, you skip the decimal and put in 15, it will take some, well, that one is one that's pretty obvious, but there are cases where if you say my Secchi depth was 1.5, you meant 1.5 meters and you got 15 meters, somebody might check that on the form, so it's necessary to have it in the form. How do you find out your lake number? If you start typing on that thing at the back that I just went out. Yeah. Yeah, if you start typing in your lake, what is lake are you? Oh, Barrett. Start typing in B-A-R-R, it'll pop up. And then you have your lake number. And I believe it is 225 or 225. Okay.
If you click on any lake on the map, it says the number right there.
Okay. So that was going to be the end of that. And now, can you bring up my next presentation? It's on the desktop. It's called Wrap Up. Okay, closing. Sure. Okay, so, yeah. So, I again, we can go to the next slide. Feedback. We have a couple different things that the feedback is really important. So we actually are going to ask you for it twice. So we really want your feedback. First thing is there's a paper copy that has been handed out to you. If you didn't get it, there's probably more. We can find more. Drop that off in the evaluation box as you go. We're going to also have an electronic one that asks a little bit more. I'm sorry, it's the blue one that Vanna White is showing you over here. Okay, then the next, we're going to send out an electronic version, which is a little bit more like some of the prior ones. There were things like how are the different speakers, how was lunch, is this too much money, is this too little money, you want to pay more for this valuable day? All right, anything. Yes. So please answer both of them. Okay. The videos. Now, there's this long YouTube channel thing. If you go to the YouTube, go to the YouTube page and search for Putnam Cornell Cooperative Extension, they show the presentations that are up there, so that would be another way. But I hope that we will send out something. We'll send out a link to this as well, but if you can't wait. All right. New volunteer training. We have, I think, about 20 people who are going to be trained downstairs. Some of you, I can't believe, are new, so maybe you've been out for a few years and are coming back, because I've seen your names. But anyway, so we're going to go over the forms and sampling and processing questions. The one thing I'll tell everybody is make sure you schedule around holidays. Now this year it's not too bad because July 4th is on a Monday. But if you're scheduling every 2 weeks, you will either hit July 4th weekend or you will hit Labor Day weekend. And so make sure you don't have a too long a hold time. It's better to sample on the Monday and ship Tuesday if you can, all right? And so thank you. There was a great team, as we've talked about, that partnered really to put this thing together. I'm so grateful to everybody, and again, to Maureen's leadership here. up, and if any of you can't stand leaving here right away and want to help, I'm sure we can find something for you to do. To our sponsors, Fix and Hydro, Pond Lake Connection, Nicerola, to all of the speakers, my goodness, I am so pleased with the quality of the presentations, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. But obviously, if you guys hadn't shown up, this would be all for naught. So thank you so much for coming. Safe travels home. Please talk to